Welcome and thank you for joining today's WEIM Regional Issues Forum. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened your chat panel by using the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance throughout the conference, you can always send a chat message to the event producer. All audio lines are currently muted to reduce background noise. But when we get to the Q&A portion of the call, you can press the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen to enter the question queue. With that, I'll go ahead and turn the call over to Josh Walter, the Regional Issues Forum Chair. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here in person and virtually over the WebEx. As mentioned, my name is Josh Walter. I'm the current Regional Issues Forum Chair and one of the two EIM entity sector liaisons. I'd like to first kick things off by making a special welcome to Joe Edo, the new Board of Governors member. Welcome. Hopefully you find this meeting informative and helpful in your new role. A couple different housekeeping things that need to be covered first. I'm going to hand it over to Anita Decker to make an announcement.
Thanks, Josh. So just we're always really sensitive to whether we have a quorum, and you'll notice today that there are 4 of the WEIM member board or governing body members here today, and normally that would constitute a quorum, but because the change to having a liaison to the governing body and to the RIF, it kind of helps with not being so sensitive about the quorum issue. And so our chairman, Rod Contazilka, and Rob is here, Rob and myself as the liaison are free to speak for the RIF, but other RIF members, so Andy Campbell, who is here, and John Prescott, who is here, they are observers in respect of the quorum sensitivities. So I think you're going to see that going forward, that we were really happy to find a way through that all the governing body members can attend when they're available. And I think it's something that the RIF has desired along the way. So we found a way through that. So thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And speaking on behalf of the RIF liaison sector group, we appreciate you all being here. It's an important aspect of the governance and deliberative process, as well as in the stakeholder process in and of itself. So knowing that this is a part of the RIF, is a part of the stakeholder community at CAISO, having the decision makers in the room on important topics like the gas panel and the effects of electrification on markets is all additive in the process to help the Board of Governors and the governing body make decisions that are brought before it. So thank you all for being here. This is the second RIF meeting of the year and the first in-person meeting. I'm happy you all could make it. Appreciate the turnout. It's been great being able to get and be in person to have a meeting like this, to deliberate, to learn, and hopefully it's a good next 4 hours or so. With that, I do want to also thank our hosts, and I welcome Vijay to introduce our hosts and our special guests.
Thank you, and welcome to Salt Lake City. Michelle and I welcome you all visiting, I think, the coolest city in the Intermountain region, so thank you. I have the pleasure to introduce Brandon Sadat. I worked at WEIM for 4 years before I moved on to WRA, and I had the pleasure to report to Brandon Sadat, who's the VP of Planning and Performance Analysis, unless that name has changed. And thank you to WEIM for offering to host the RIF meeting here. Brandon, please.
Great, thank you, Vijay, and thank you everyone for traveling to Salt Lake. For those of you who are here in person, welcome to our office space. For a minute, I just want to talk a little bit about our office space here. Who has been to the WEC offices before? You raise your hand. I know I can't see anybody on the online. Yeah, so several of you who are in the room have been here before, and I want to talk a little bit about the transformation of this building specifically. So here are some facts for you, especially those of you who are history buffs. You might find this entertaining. So the Salt Lake Hardware Building was built in 1909, largely in response to the development of the intercontinental railroads. And so just north of here, an hour or so, is where the Golden Spike is located, and that's when they joined the railroads together. It was a big deal. At the time, the hardware building, when it was constructed, was the largest warehouse west of Chicago, and a lot of people argue that it was the largest warehouse in the country at the time. Kind of seems hard to believe because, you know, tucked in Salt Lake City now, the building doesn't seem like it's all that large. But at the time, it was the largest warehouse building. If you've been down to the first floor, you've probably seen some pictures of old catalog pages that show some of the products that were distributed out of the Salt Lake Hardware Building. So at the time, they would send out, you know, household items, appliances, different types of hardware, even guns. There's a lot of horse accessories that I've seen on those catalog pages. But that's generally what the building was used for. And at the time, it was very high tech. So you probably didn't notice this, but the ceiling on the first floor is actually a little bit higher. So those ceilings are 14 feet high. And in the days when this was a distribution center, they would bring in horses and wagons on the first floor. And they intentionally made the ceilings 14 feet high. So as they were unloading the wagons, if the horses decided to rear up, they wouldn't hit their head on the ceiling. And so that was very intentional. If you're able to make it into the atrium, you probably also saw this giant metal spiral slide looking thing. And I get a lot of people that ask, you know, can you ride that down? It goes all the way from the 5th floor to the bottom.
Some of us tried to do it.
Yeah, some of us tried to do it. Yeah. There's quite a drop off on the first floor, but at the time that was actually state of the art as well. They had designed that slide so that if there were products on the 5th floor that they wanted to get down to the shipping level quickly, they could put it on the slide and it would maintain a constant speed going down, so it wouldn't pick up speed and then come crashing down. I found a quote about this slide at the time. It said, "It was the most modern equipment available for the purpose." So it was a pretty big deal. And today we've kept it just because it's kind of neat. It's a great conversation piece. So at the hardware building, business thrived for the first part of the 20th century. So after it was developed, a lot of products coming in and going out of here. The owners of the hardware building were making a lot of money. However, as the century progressed, around the middle of the century, toward the end of the century, a lot of retailers started purchasing supplies directly from wholesalers. And so this industry started to really suffer. And by 1986, the building was completely closed down and condemned. So there was nothing here. And it remained that way for several years until late in the 1990s, some other businessmen in the Salt Lake area who owned several restaurants decided to take a chance. And I remember reading an article from one of them who said as they walked through, it was kind of a creepy space. As you can imagine, it had been condemned for several years. And I think when the business left, they just kind of left everything the way it was. But after several years and convincing many investors to invest in this space, as you can see, they were able to successfully convert it into the office space that it is now. And it's actually a great space to work in, great conversation piece. I will say this is probably pre-pandemic, but a lot of people like to host wedding receptions here just because it's such a unique place to be with all of the beams and the bricks and a lot of the historical significance. So you're probably wondering, why is he talking about this? Okay, that's interesting. But, you know, as I think about the power industry and some of the transformation that we're going through, I think there's a lot of parallels to what we've seen in the historic hardware building. I sat down and I tried to just think through and list some of the transformative moments that we've been experiencing over the last 10 or so years. And I came up with a lot of different things, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but, you know, just the change in changing resource mix that we're seeing. The evolution from, large baseload, primarily coal and other types of fossil fueled units to more of a renewable blend is a huge transformation. Well, that's happening at the same time that we're starting to experience a lot more extreme weather events. Over the last several years, we've seen things like heat domes, heat waves, extreme freezing weather, atmospheric rivers, polar vortexes, and I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Things that we once thought were rare, 1 in 100 type year events, we're starting to see them regularly. And it's something that's particularly affecting this industry. Load is changing. I've been to several conferences over the last 6 months or a year, and it really feels like the conversations around electrification, which I understand we're going to be talking about at this meeting, the conversations around electrification, particularly with electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, the conversations around data centers that are moving into areas and doubling load pretty much overnight are becoming more and more frequent. We're really seeing the change in load patterns because of the types of resources that we have on the system now. A lot of industry changes. So the fact that these types of meetings are occurring, we're seeing evolution in market structures within the West. We're seeing discussions around different types of markets, RTO formation. We now have the Western Resource Adequacy Program. These are all just indicators of the types of transformation that we're all part of currently. And, I truly believe that the success of this transformation, just like the success of the transformation of the hardware building, is fully dependent on the collaboration and coordination of all of us. These aren't any issues that any one entity or organization can solve single-handedly. And so it's really exciting for me to see the level of collaboration, the level of conversation that's happening within the West right now. I feel that we're all fully prepared to stand up and face the challenges that are ahead of us, the challenges that we're currently facing. And, I would just encourage all of you, because this is our space. I have to give a shout out to some of the work products that WEC has been able to develop with our stakeholders over the last several years. But it's an exciting opportunity for stakeholders to engage in some of the studies and the analysis that we're currently doing. Our Reliability Assessment Committee, which is one of our stakeholder committees, is working on a study program. They're looking at a lot of different year 10 and year 20 out type efforts to try and understand and get their arms around some of the uncertainty that we're facing as an industry. So I would really encourage you to engage, participate where you can and how you can. Like I said, I think the challenges we're facing are huge and can only be overcome with the collective effort of all of our industry stakeholders in the West. And I'll just leave you with a quote as we think about the transformation of this industry. And that is, honor the past, live in the present, but build for the future. I really look forward to the conversations that we're going to have over the next couple of days here. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Brandon. Before we get going, one last announcement, housekeeping piece. We will be having a reception afterwards, immediately after the meeting. I just wanted to make a special thank you to the sponsors of the reception, Pacificor, and UAMPS have agreed to help support the reception afterwards. So I appreciate your help and support on that. And we are ready to go into the our first section. Lindsay Schleckway from NV Energy is facilitating a panel on gas management issues related to market dispatch. So I'd like to hand it over to her and we can kick things off.
Thank you. Okay, so I will be the moderator for today's gas management issues panel. I wanted to provide quickly a little bit of background. We are holding this panel because participants within the EIM continue to state that it is difficult to manage gas resources and balance gas pipeline nominations. Therefore, this panel will explore the various gas management issues that are experienced by market participants in the real-time market timeframe and the concerns for EDAM. The objective for this panel is to highlight and explain the gas management issues in order to launch this topic for further stakeholder discussion. First, I'd like to go ahead and thank all of the panelists for agreeing to be a part of this panel and provide your perspectives on this issue. And to provide a little bit of context into the structure for today's panel, we will first hear from Pacific Gas and Electric about their ability to manage gas today. And then we will open it up to the EIM entity sector on their issues that currently exist and concerns for EDAM. Once the speakers have finished providing their perspectives, then we will open it up for panel discussion. And then finally, we will hear the next steps that are likely to occur from CAISO. If time permits, then I'll open it up for additional questions at the end. And then since we have several traders on this panel, I wanted to read a very brief antitrust statement. In general, the types of discussion to be avoided are those that may suggest or tend to reflect agreement among competitors, such as price fixing, fees, prices, production, sales, bids, costs, customer credit, and other terms of sale that could impact price, allocation of customers or markets, bid rigging, boycotts, or joint refusals to do business with others, sales or marketing strategies, company-specific confidential or proprietary information. If at any time during the course of this meeting you believe that any sensitive topic under the antitrust laws is being discussed or is about to be discussed, please speak up to halt the discussion. So first, let's kick it off with Mike McDermott. He is a gas trader at Pacific Gas and Electric.
Thank you, Lindsay. Is my mic on? Got it. Thank you, Lindsay. And thanks for all these introductions. It was great, Brandon. I really enjoyed that one. So I'm Mike McDermott, as Lindsay said, a gas trader with Pacific Gas and Electric. So PG&E is a investor-owned utility headquartered in Oakland, California now. PG&E procures gas and electricity on behalf of over 5 million customers from Bakersfield, just north of Los Angeles, to the Oregon border. PG&E owns and operates Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, as well as a lot of the hydro that's continuing to stream off the mountain after that incredible snowpack we got this winter. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about natural gas and how it pertains to PG&E's electricity generators. So as a local distribution company, PG&E owns and operates its own natural gas pipeline network for the purposes of delivering gas to its customers. PG&E's rates and services are regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission, unlike interstate pipelines, which are regulated by FERC. So PG&E has 3 lines of gas business. Can we jump slides real quick? Great. So PG&E has 3 gas lines of business. The first one, California Gas Transmission, is a business unit of PG&E that operates and maintains the transmission, the local distribution, and the storage assets. They provide backbone services through their transportation and market center business lines. Such services include parking and lending and short-term storage on an as-available basis. So market participants can negotiate with CGT to procure parking and lending services. The next 2 lines of business are essentially customers of California Gas Transmission. Gas Supply procures gas on behalf of PG&E's bundled gas customers. And then Electric Gas Supply, otherwise known as Electric Fuels, that is my department. We procure gas for our owned and contracted electric generation facilities. Both PG&E, or both CGS and EGS, gas supply and electric gas supply, procure gas throughout the Western U.S. and utilize pipeline capacity to bring the natural gas to Northern California. We also manage risk by optimizing storage as well as utilizing natural gas financial products. Quick change of slide. Thank you. Okay, a little small here, but looking at the Western pipeline network, if you look closely, you can see that most of the gas supplied to PG&E is not sourced in California. The production basins, they're the gray blobs up there on the slide, located in Western Canada, the Rocky Mountains, and the San Juan basins. So PG&E can buy the gas close to the production basins and ship it ourselves, or we can rely on others to ship it to us and pick up the gas at the Malin or the Topac interconnection points with PG&E's system. Then we would buy PG&E backbone transportation to bring the gas to PG&E's customers or generators. PG&E can buy it straight up at PG&E City Gate and let the shippers do all the work. But having contracts at different locations would allow us to have geographical diversification from where we get the gas, and this can increase reliability that we bring to our customers. It also allows us to optimize our portfolio when prices fluctuate throughout the region. So especially during periods of extreme events like the Texas power crisis, the big chill when Texas froze and prices in some locations went extremely high, while others remained normalized. But that's Texas, and we're not here to talk about Texas. We're here to talk about California, and specifically PG&E's generators that reside within the California ISO. As such, it is PG&E, it is my department, Electric Gas Supplies, job to determine the natural gas needs for our customers, or for our electric generators, I should say, which are then, the generation is then offered into the ISO. So we first do this on a long-term basis by entering into futures contracts. Then we true it up on a monthly basis as we get closer and start determining our needs. And ultimately, we try to forecast our EG electric generator demand that we're submitting the bids into the California ISO. So a quick slide switch. Yeah, so to do this, we look beyond our own service territory into the broader ISO balancing area to try to determine our needs. And because the ISO has these huge interconnections with this Northwest and the Southwest, we try to determine what the flows are going to be on those transmission lines like Cobb, California-Oregon border, Knob, Palo Verde, and Meade. Those interties with the ISO. These used to be a little more predictable, but just like Brandon said, the resource mix within the WEC is changing, and as such, the import-export situation on these interties has been changing as well. So we look at prices at the trading hubs like Mid-C and Palo Verde to try to determine what the flows are going to be, to try to determine what our dispatch inside the ISO may be to perhaps supply those needs outside, or if there's imports coming in, then our generation may not be dispatched. Speaking of the changing resource mix, we also look at the wind and the solar forecasts. The wind, we know that the solar during the winter can vary greatly with the cloud coverage, and wind also, I will give it to wind. Wind has been very complementary towards solar recently. It's been strong in the mornings and the evenings, and dipping down when the solar has been shining bright and producing megawatts. So the other thing we look at is the dynamics between SoCal and PG&E Citygate gas prices, because all things being equal and the ISO having transmission to go north and south, we will PG&E the cheaper gas priced generation will be dispatched first by the ISO. And when those prices change, we could get flips in whether Northern California or Southern California generators are being called on. Finally, we look at some days we're getting dispatched in the day ahead, then we're not we're getting awards in the day ahead market, and we're not getting real-time dispatches. Those are a little bit harder to predict, but over time patterns can emerge. Quick flip of the slide, and we'll talk about the ISO timeline, and which introduces complications, which I think many people know about, but I will review it. So the ISO runs a day-ahead IFM market and produces awards based on bids on a rolling 7-day basis. The awards come out around 1 p.m., 1300, we'll call it in the business. Meanwhile, gas trades 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, trading on Friday for Saturday through Monday. It is usually concluded around 7 a.m. So we have a time so we forecast, and then we have to wait to determine what our day-ahead awards are going to be. So the EIM has arguably increased this variability between the IFM and the real-time dispatches based on the other EIM entities being involved in the ISO solution in real time. But I will admit, with millions of dollars in savings. So there's complications on the gas side, but I understand it's also resulted in billions of dollars in savings. So now to the underlying question: how do we manage gas? How do we manage our gas in the ISO? So first of all, we've got a pretty robust PG&E Citygate has a pretty robust day-ahead trading market on ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange. That's the trading platform. We've got a lot of market participants. We've got people who own transport. We've got storage providers, end users supplying customers, independent power producers, and utility-owned generators. So this translates to a lot of buying and selling on ICE. So it's a pretty robust market that PG&E Citygate is. Then we've got our market center services that I mentioned, the parking and lending and short-term storage that we can do. We can work with PG&E's California Gas Transmission Market Center. Of course, we've got we've got the independent storage providers with names like Wild Goose and Gill Ranch, Lodi, and Central Valley Storage. We've got a lot of storage providers on the system. And so for a price, same thing with the parking and lending, this comes with a price. We can arrange to have a inventory level, a maximum inventory level with a injection and withdrawal ratio for the day. And that can be really helpful. For instance, let's say we forecasted for 100,000 decatherm award from the ISO for our generators, and that comes in, we get our awards back, and it's only 50,000. If we had 50,000 decatherms of injection capability with a storage provider, we'd be able to inject, meet our demand, and be done with it. So the independent storage providers, which I know not everybody has, provides a big benefit for the PG&E system. Then we've got our pipeline transportation contracts, which allows us to buy at locations outside of PG&E's system. This gives us the geographical diversification to manage positions at other locations. So we can flow the gas if we want, or if prices are favorable, we can sell the gas off. Finally, we're allowed to maintain an imbalance, a daily and a monthly imbalance with the pipeline. So, so we can keep a running balance going for the on a daily balance that can roll through the month. And as long as we're within a tolerance, we can move that to a short-term storage account with the pipeline. Now, the pipeline will issue operational flow orders, OFOs, to maintain the integrity of the pipe. That's when they've got too much gas on the system or too little gas on the system. They will issue, say, a high inventory OFO that comes with a penalty and a tolerance band. So someone might be, let's say, a $5 penalty with a 10% tolerance band. If you've nominated 100,000 decatherms of gas and there was a 10% tolerance, you can burn up to 110,000 before you were issued a penalty. But just point being, they will issue OFOs to keep the integrity of the pipe. So in summary, PG&E's the tools that we have to manage gas, which I should have asked to flip the slide, sorry. There we go. Yes, so we've got, like I said, we've got a pretty robust day-ahead trading market on the Intercontinental Exchange and with voice brokers. So we can do a lot of buying and selling there. We've got our market center services as Parks and Lens, where for a fee we can negotiate with the pipeline. Independent storage provider contracts can be real helpful in managing supply and demand. And then our transportation to be able to buy closer to those production basins. And finally, the pipeline balancing, where we can be out of balance for a day and roll that through the month and enter into a short-term storage contract with our pipeline. So with that, I'll stop for now. Look forward to clarifying anything in the panel discussion, but that's what I had for my part.
Thank you, Mike. Next, we will move on to both Jason and Joe, who I believe are presenters. They're going to be on the phone. But we have Jason Hartzell, Manager of Fuels and Contracts from Arizona Public Service, and Joe Jacklone, Manager of Fuel Supply Management from Salt River Project. Yeah. Okay.
You all hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks, Lindsay. And thanks, Mike. I appreciate you kind of teeing up some of the concepts that Joe and I will continue to kind of reiterate and maybe just provide a little bit different flavor from an Arizona-centric maybe perspective here a little bit. So my name is Jason Hartzell. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm the Manager of Fuels and Contracts for Arizona Public Service. And today I'm going to just talk about, again, Arizona kind of centric view. And so if you want to flip to the next slide, Arizona has, over the years, the last 5 years in particular, seen a substantial change in kind of the gas transportation capacity available to us to keep up with things like growing customer demand and coal retirements that are happening in the Southwest. all of which are driving an increased utilization of gas in the Southwest in general. And another one of the major pressures, if you're looking at the map here, there's only two major pipelines flowing through Arizona. Those are the El Paso and Transwestern pipelines. The southernmost pipeline, the El Paso South Main Line, we call it, it has gas that flows both into California, but also south into Mexico, which is in the near future causing some additional demand through LNG export facilities in Mexico that are set to come online in 2024. So we've kind of got a growing demand on the pipelines that are flowing through Arizona. They're fully subscribed, so access to new gas on those pipelines is constrained without major pipeline expansion. And those transportation, the utilization continues to increase year over year on the natural gas system there. With no local gas storage options available to us, other than maybe some park and lend type options that were previously kind of mentioned on a previous slide. And so if you move on to the next slide, not only are there kind of limited pipelines, but those pipelines are complex. So, you know, you're talking 24, 36-inch pipelines that you have to have contracted at particular locations. So whether you're using, and you know, a little bit of background on Arizona Public Services, we're 100% electric utility. And so we have to have specific path rights that go directly to our generating facilities. Some of those facilities might be combined cycles, some of them might be combustion turbines, and so they're serving different needs, and they may get called by a market for different, you know, cost profiles or times, maybe startup requirements. And so those transportation contracts, as I mentioned, are driven by locational needs going specifically to the power plants. And we serve those plants using primary pathing rights. These are specific point-to-point path rights from a production basin, which may be located in New Mexico or Texas, and having to ship that gas all the way to Arizona on a specific path. And those transportation rights are firm rights if they are used on a specific path and a particular volume that you have contracted with the pipeline. Outside of that, those are non-firm rights. So, and the later that you go into the gas nomination cycles, those rights lessen as well, or your ability to access your 100% firm rights may lessen as well. So those are all challenges in if you don't have a schedule the day before for those plants to be online and or the capability to manage within your contractual rights, it becomes a complex thing to have to deal with. So Southwest Electric Utilities generally have kind of long-term firm gas transportation contracts to serve our load obligations. So if you flip to the next slide, not only are the pipeline kind of set up down specific paths, but the pipelines generally only offer a limited amount of services in transporting gas when you're scheduling it on a daily basis. The graph on the right-hand side here shows what the blue is kind of the most common, and this is, you know, firm rights that are allocated each hour across a day. So gas has to flow kind of very consistently from hour to hour across the entire day. There are flexible gas contracts, but this utilizes more space on the pipeline itself, and those contracts are more limited in the ability to be able to procure the more flexible, in this example, FTH8, where you can take your total gas schedule for the day, but burn it in an 8-hour period to hourly flexibility during the middle of the day. And so exceeding these rights, again, this is an important concept when you're talking about market activity. So if you didn't schedule and or buy that gas, and now you are being called to operate a plant without having scheduled to burn that gas, you may be subject to either your own transportation limits and what you had scheduled, but also subject to financial penalties. And Mike was talking about strained operating conditions and how the pipelines deal with some of those. So that kind of shows you just how gas flows on the pipeline. And this next slide, I'm going to show you how, as a utility, we expect to utilize gas both now and into the future. So as renewable penetration continues to increase on the system, I've got a graph here on the left-hand side that shows a typical March day and how gas consumption occurs in our forecast in 2023. And that shows, a dipping of gas usage in the middle of the day, but generally speaking, not a significant spike from a morning to an evening peak. That can't be, somewhat mitigated. But in the future, 2040, as a for instance, you've got more renewable penetration where you're not using much, if any, gas at all during the middle of the day, and you're really using it to hit evening peaks when solar's not shining, or maybe if there's a lower, wind output as we increase wind penetration on the system. And so this is not how the pipelines are designed to operate. Not many contracts can fill these types of voids on the contract. And with limited storage or local storage capability, this could both drive reliability and price risk into the future if we're not careful at having options that can, mitigate these types of spikes. So with that, I'm going to pass the presentation off to Joe to talk more about dealing with these scheduling conflicts and some of the dynamics of the timelines that we're working with to manage these gas burns.
All right, thank you very much, Jason. I think I might be getting a little feedback here. Hopefully that's better. All right, yeah, my name's Joe Giacalone, and I manage the gas trading and scheduling operations at SRP, which is a Arizona-based electric utility. If we could go on to the next slide, I think it's slide 6. There we go. One of the things I wanted to speak to specifically are the challenges that we've come across as we evaluate a day-ahead organized market, in this case EDAM. And one of the major challenges on the gas side is the mismatch between when gas is traded, when gas is scheduled, and when power awards, purchases, or sales of energy are likely to be made. So in Arizona, for those of us on pretty much El Paso or Transwestern, and pretty much throughout the entire West, in the summer, the majority of gas trading takes place between 4:30 and 6:30 a.m. That's when the majority of the liquidity trades. In the winter, since Arizona does not change time, that then goes back an hour to 5:30 to 7:30. So typically in the past, we work closely with our power trading teams to make sure we're meeting load and any wholesale obligations. And we do that in that window between 4:30 and 6:30 a.m. Again, the majority of the liquidity is during that period. After that, there's about a 4-hour window for what's known as the timely scheduling cycle to conclude. So we then take time after the actual procurement of gas, about 3-4 hours to schedule gas. That is our supply for the next day. So for example, the trading that took place today, at least in Arizona time, will flow between 7 a.m. tomorrow and then 7 a.m. on Friday. That will be our gas day. Scheduling is concluded at 11 a.m. After that, you do have a late evening cycle, and then you have some intraday cycles on the actual day of flow, but the liquidity is much less than what is traded in the timely cycle, that morning session before the day of flow. And obviously the price is unknown. So that creates a lot of risk. If you're being asked to, if your EDAM award, if you will, is to sell a certain amount of megawatts, we will either have to pull gas from storage if that is even possible. And our storage facilities are located out of state. So that could be problematic from a transportation availability standpoint. Or you have to procure evening or intraday supplies. Again, price unknown, liquidity very limited. So we have risk financially, operationally, between the award that EDAM makes and our ability to procure gas and procure it at a price which matches up and is in line with the price we're receiving for the power. So like I mentioned, intraday gas, procuring it later that day, the next day is problematic. I know Jason is going to speak to some possible solutions, recommendations later in this slide deck. A couple of which that we have discussed previously is either A, moving the award window up into that 4:30 to 6:30 a.m. timeframe, or B, presenting what I would say is a binding range. So for example, our gas burns tomorrow will require somewhere between 30 to 50,000 decatherms. We could then go out, procure the midpoint, for example, and then utilize some of the tools that our previous speaker from PG&E mentioned to balance that last 5 or 10,000 decatherms. So again, from the time we started looking at this has really been one of the main sticking points, is our ability to procure gas and match it up with the power award, and something that we certainly look forward to, continuing to talk to the CAISO folks and other, potential EDM participants to see if we can't come up with a solution that mitigates our risk. On the next slide, Lindsay, is something, again, that our previous speaker spoke to, and that is the mismatch between the gas days and the power days. For those of us in the WEC, we're all very well aware of this. This has gone on for decades. I'd say it's manageable during weekdays. Probably the largest mismatch for us occurs on, putting holidays aside, which are even further complicated, occurs really on Saturday when power is traded on Thursday, and we do not procure the gas until Friday. So we are already carrying some unknown risk going into that. And again, this would just kind of compound that risk. So, hopefully it's something that we can, we can reach a solution that works for everybody. But as of now, it's a very important issue, at least for utilities in Arizona, which I can certainly speak to. And I'll turn it back over to Jason on that note.
Thanks, Joe. All right, so I'm going to wrap up kind of just what we've mentioned here and chatted about so far. So going to the next slide, just kind of a summary of challenges for Arizona utilities. There's limited pipeline contractual rights available for us to go get new gas to be able to serve load into the future to meet some of the demands that we're talking about with retiring, coal and even renewables that haven't, been added as quickly as we had anticipated. Gas flow and electric demand are mismatched. The gas and the power day are mismatched. So Joe just kind of went through those. We've got limited visibility on the gas needed during the trading windows. So the EDAM awards or any future market awards aren't really known at the time that you're doing your gas trade. There's no formal mechanism today to inform the market of what those gas burn limitations are. So when we're limited on our contractual rights, there's no way to limit those. And on the next slide, you'll see we've got some recommendations on how just to deal with some of these challenges. one of the recommendations being providing a nomogram or a similar type of a mechanism to inform the market software of what those gas limits are. There's a reference level change request process out there today that just really isn't that user friendly. So if we could, modify that in some way to at least be able to address these price risks that we're seeing, provide a multi-day market run look ahead for gas burn projections. And this is kind of piggybacks off what Joe just mentioned, but just having maybe a range of possibilities so that we at least know the upper and lower bounds that we're working within. And then last, a closer alignment between when the awards the EDM market awards occur and the gas trading schedules occur. So just tighter alignment to when that would occur would also help mitigate some of these gas risks moving forward. So with that, that concludes APS and SRP's portion of this. So we'll turn it back over to Lindsay in the forum.
Thank you, Joe and Jason. Okay, so next we'll move it on to Steve Vendrich. He's a senior energy market trader at PacifiCorp.
Thank you. So I'm with PacifiCorp. I've been there for 30 years. You can go to the next slide. So discussion topics, we'll discuss the currently how we establish gas generations for day ahead in real time, some of the opportunities that EDAM can provide, and then concerns, reiterate some of those concerns that have been mentioned previously for gas hedging. Next slide. So PacifiCorp, who we kind of are, who we are basically is we exist ultimately in 6 states. We have 2 balancing authorities, what we call PacifiCorp West and PacifiCorp East. We're connected through transmission lines that kind of extend our control areas from the Northwest all the way into Utah. Peak load is around 12 and change. Typically that's in the summertime. And we have quite a mix with our generation portfolio. Coal, gas, hydro, wind, solar. And go to the next slide. So this is what we call PacifiCorp East, and in the gray boxes are the units that we utilize to serve load. And PacifiCorp East would be primarily Wyoming and Utah. We utilize multiple transportation companies to move our gas to the actual plant. And we have a little bit of storage. We have a BCF of storage, but that's very small relative to the allowances that we're, the ability that we actually have day to day to inject and withdraw. So we utilize the Questar pipeline or Mountain West or Williams now to move the majority of our gas. And we trade points like Questar North, Questar South, White River, and Goshen as primary points that we utilize gas purchases to move on firm transportation that we have through those counterparties. We also use Kern, and then part of our generation actually sits behind Questar Gas, the LDC. You can go to the next slide. On the west side, we have a couple plants. It's definitely quite a bit smaller than what we the load requirements that we have in the Utah-Wyoming region, but we do have generation in Washington, Chehalis, and in Oregon, Hermiston. And we utilize, for the Chehalis unit, we have firm transportation. Basically, that serves all the requirements on Northwest Pipeline. For our Hermiston gen, we have transportation actually all the way into Canada on Nova and Foothills and along GTN, and then into Cascade, which is where Hermiston sits. But once again, it's the same picture. We trade Sumas and Kingsgate for the most part and Stanfield to serve those needs, but we do heavily lean on our firm transportation to serve those requirements. Next slide. So on the right side, you can kind of see the size of our units and the location. Majority of those units, like I was saying before, are in Utah and Wyoming, and that portfolio is expected to kind of continue to grow with some of the coal to gas conversions that we're considering. But our strategy on a overall perspective, obviously, is to physically balance and financially hedge our fleet, our gas requirements. We're also required to schedule natural gas on each individual pipeline to line up with the purchases that we have. In order to kind of determine what's the most economic way to balance our system, we utilize PCI, which is an optimization tool that gives us a suggested run to serve primarily PacifiCorp's load requirements. But we do consider when we do set up from a day ahead perspective, from procuring enough gas, we also consider, what EIM has been dispatching the units at. We also consider different variables, but PCI basically is the optimization tool that we kind of lean on, and we utilize expected natural gas prices versus the power prices. And then obviously availability goes into that, forecasted loads. We also take into account firm transmission, PacifiCorp transmission to serve our loads. We also utilize our gas resources to assist with any sort of reserve requirements that are called upon. Next slide. So this is basically the same information that I think we've all been hearing with the concerns about misalignments of power days and gas days. I think, I don't need to really expand on it, but we do utilize, we are required to submit all nominations to the pipelines prior to nomination deadlines. And I list the times up above there, where the timely cycles are required to have all schedules submitted by 11 a.m. Evening, you basically have till 4. And then the intraday cycles pick up in the next morning, which is kind of a concern, that we're just not able to line up the power dispatches versus the nomination cycles that we're given. One of the things that I think is concerning that I don't know that we've really expanded on is that if there was open transportation, if we don't utilize our fully utilize our transportation in the timely cycle, there's a potential that the pipelines actually will resell our transportation as early as the evening cycle, meaning if I didn't have the correct nomination in on the timely cycle, there's no guarantee that I'm going to be able to utilize all my firm transportation going forward. So even though I have that transportation, I may be just paying for it, which is part of what we're dealing with right now, but it is a concern. Next slide. So the daily coordination that we have with our generation desk and real time is we basically set up the day ahead, but we're also responsible for managing changes that occur within the real-time generation desk. So we basically hand the real-time generation desk what we expect to run by hour for the power day. We also show them what our total gas burn is for power day and gas day. And then we break that into individual plans for our generation desk to meet the expected gas burn. Any deviations with that expectation, we may be forced into same day sort of markets, which, as previously noted, is huge bid-ask spreads. You're also leaning on more interruptible potential. We also communicate to our generation desk any sort of pipeline restrictions that we're faced with. Obviously, dealing with multiple pipelines, different pipelines have specific restrictions that we may have to adhere to avoid any sort of penalties that we could be faced with. We also give our real-time generation desk a limit for each plant, an upper bandwidth that they can burn to, as well as a lower bandwidth. And that's just more or less to alleviate any issues, potential issues with burdening a pipeline with excess gas or shorting the pipeline. So we basically give the real-time a bandwidth, and we try to make it wide enough that gives them some flexibility. But if the real-time generation desk feels like they're going to move through the upper bandwidth or the lower bandwidth, that's when we actually go to same-day sort of markets and try to price up something for them. We also notify what kind of minimum and maximum capacity each plant is working with, so they're working within the range that we were given. We give them indicative pricing using daily markets as well as real-time markets, and also try to specify any sort of financial penalties that we may be assessed with if we either overburn or underburn. It's important that we do carry lifetime imbalances at each plant. I mean, it's just part of this business. But I also try to communicate that with them so they understand, whether we set up the day trying to short the pipe or we set up the day trying to pack, trying to get that life-to-date imbalance back to zero. I mean, that's our ultimate goal. And then any sort of unit configuration that the plant was dispatched at on a day ahead, whether it was either on or off. Next slide. So, I mean, obviously with EDAM, I mean, I think we're all aware of the benefits that EIM has provided us, and I think that it certainly increases that. I mean, we're going to be more efficient at meeting loads, optimizing any sort of resources, and we're also lowering our carbon emissions, I think, is a huge thing. Obviously, I think we've continued to mention the concerns that we have, which is the power day and the gas day not aligning. The timing of the published awards, actually the first cycle that we could even participate in is going to be evening, given that there were any deviations in our proposed free schedule. And then the point that I was making earlier, that there is a potential that we could lose firm transportation as the transport companies look to actually optimize their transport. Concerns that I think I'm sure will be addressed is how do we communicate any OFOs or balancing restrictions or even cuts that we
we may see on any of the cycles. And then, the obvious question of additional hedging, increased risk. Liquidity is also a concern. And with the additional hedging, obviously, there's the concern of the dispatch price being different than the actual hedged price. And next slide. And I think that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, and lastly, to wrap things up, we have Anu Sawhney. He is the Forward Marketing Manager at Los Angeles Department of Water and Power.
Thank you, Nancy. I think most of the folks have actually talked about the challenges already. What I'll try to do is simplify the problem so I understand not everyone here is a gas expert, and neither am I, just as a disclaimer. But so if I can understand the problem, simplify it and see how we can together work towards a resolution. Firstly, next slide, please. Thank you. So we've repeatedly heard this, that, hey, CAISO entities have been able to handle the issues in the past. And so other entities, should be able to handle it as well. But today we've heard from the likes of APS, SRP, and the other folks too. The difference therein is we don't really have that much storage capability that may be available for the other folks, right? And we don't have any capability of trading with industrial customers. We don't have any lending, parking sort of arrangement. We don't have any borrowing or loaning arrangement either. So what really happens, and I know folks have talked about the timeline issue, I'll briefly touch on that again. I know you guys have seen that so many times, but I'll simplify it and see if I can explain in a manner that folks can understand better. But the problem that comes with a market is you're getting impacted through these transfers in EIM, and we believe it's going to be increased in the EDAM footprint. And you really don't have a good way of forecasting it, because it's really not your optimization, your load that's going to be impacting that solely. There's actually a lot of stuff going on within the market footprint, but outside of your footprint that you're trying to optimize. So we've tried internally to try and put a tool together, but it's still in works. So that's a big challenge, and that challenge is amplified by the fact that the load forecasting itself is not accurate either, right? And load forecasting just not for our area, overall market as well, because everything else on one side, load forecast on the other side. If that's not accurate, you're going to be bound to have imbalances both on energy and impactfully on the gas imbalance side. We already see this due to EIM participation. We already see this over underburning of the natural gas. We expect it to be even bigger in terms of volume and financial and reliability concern as we go into EDAM. And I'm sure that concern is shared by most of the folks here. Now, the problem exists in day ahead and real time, as we know, and CAISO market optimization, as we go towards EDAM, we believe needs to consider the UFO conditions in unit dispatchment and dispatch. And I'll touch upon that in a bit again as well. Next slide, please. Just talking quickly about the timeline. So as I believe Joe mentioned as well, that most of the gas trading happens early in the morning, right? For tomorrow, it happens between 5 and 6 LA time. Keep in mind, at this time, we actually haven't even traded for bilateral trades, right? So whatever gas we procure at this time has and will be impacted, and there will be an imbalance created by the bilateral world. Beyond that, you have the CAISO awards, the day-ahead awards that come out. In the EDAM world, there'll be the EDAM transfers that come out to, and that will create more imbalance, right? So our gas traders are trying to balance all this. By the time they get to 12 noon or so, once the CAISO awards are out, they're in imbalance again. They try to balance it again. Comes to evening time, that's when mostly these operational flow orders get declared. Right, so imagine you start with a balance, somewhat balanced, because you already have some uncertainty in your load forecast. You come down, and after your day-ahead awards get published or bilateral awards are finalized, your gas traders are now trying to get into balance again. Now comes the day-ahead awards, they're in imbalance again, And then finally, when they try and see, okay, now I'm in balance, now comes the OFO penalties and OFO declarations, right? So this is an ongoing issue that the gas traders are trading with on a daily basis. And not to say the real-time impact, the EIM impact, and the limitations that come in EIM, in fact, create bigger challenges as well. So why is this a problem or a bigger problem now? I think we all would agree that the aging infrastructure, frequent pipeline outages, lesser storage, all these things are contributing to OFOs being declared more frequently, right? And with OFOs come the financial implications, but also come the reliability concern if those OFOs are not adhered to. Now, on the financial side, I know CAISO has a reference level pricing mechanism, and I'll allude to how that could be potentially improved upon, but that could take care of your financial concerns, but the pipeline reliability concerns still exist, right? And the bigger these imbalances become, and the more pipeline outages exist on our system, we're really creating a reliability concern over here. So it's imperative that we all get together and try and talk about all these solutions in the near future. A more accurate gas forecast that takes cognizance of use limitations, gas zones, and operational constraints. That's something that's ought to be considered for these market run and optimization runs. I believe a two-day head run will at least provide an initial position for the entities, for the EIM and EDAM entities, so they have some sort of an idea as to how much gas do they really need to be procuring. Because if the other choice is actually moving the timeline with the electric day, but that causes another increase in uncertainty, because now you're looking at the entire optimization run from a further away timeline and creates more uncertainty as well. Next slide, please. So just quickly, I'll try and wrap up with the takeaways here. I believe a CAISO two-day head transfer forecast that needs to be expanded to all EDAM participants. How we implement that is something that we can be discussed between CAISO and the stakeholders, obviously, but I believe there's a current methodology of simulated bids that are considered, either that or requiring two-day head bids and schedules to be submitted by EDAM participants. That's something that should be and could be considered. So we have a more market footprint-wide accurate forecast that would give an initial idea of how much gas burn we collectively are looking at. Also, the reference level pricing mechanism that I alluded to, I believe it's right now it's a pretty complicated and a manual process. If that process can be automated, that would definitely help with recovery of commitment costs and bid cost recovery. Some sort of a bid cost recovery mechanism similar to what exists right now in CAISO energy side of things can definitely be implemented on the gas side of things as well, I think. Also, development of group constraints to reflect use limitations, gas zones, operational characteristics, including OFOs. That's something that could be communicated to the CAISO before they actually run the market. That definitely could help. And in the end, I would like to say that, you know, all these issues are irrelevant if the load forecast in the day and time frame exceeds. From our perspective, you know, anything beyond 3% really causes more imbalance. So I know folks have said that EIM has brought about a lot of savings in millions and billions of it, but I think we're still leaving some more savings on table, and there's definitely a realization here that we could be saving more. So that's what I had.
Thank you, Anu. Okay, so before turning things over to CAISO and their next steps, I wanted to first open it up for some questions for the different panelists on the issues. And I do actually have one for you, Mike, to kind of kick things off. You were one of the few panelists who mentioned the use of storage to help manage the gas issues. And so I was wondering how important the gas storage is for balancing and maintaining your gas nominations. And if you think that you would be able to meet your real-time market awards if the storage did not exist.
Thank you. Yeah, let me start by saying I think storage plays a huge, oh, Mike, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I would say storage plays a huge part in being able to manage supply and demand. I should state storage comes with a cost. But what I'd elaborate on is the fact that the more storage that is out in the market, the more liquid the market becomes. If I'm just a storage provider, if I just own storage, I can be a buyer and a seller in the market, depending on where prices go. So storage really gives somebody the leverage to be able to meet that, to miss their forecast and then just make it up through the injection or the withdrawal. I know we've been talking about, the gas and the trading, the gas and the electricity trading out of alignment. I think we have a 5-day gas coming up for 4th of July. We're going to trade 5 days of gas where the ISO will continue to run a day ahead market. Depending on the weather, we could see huge swings within that time period. And so the awards and the gas burns that an electric generator like PG&E may incur differently throughout that time period. You may be off, you may not, your generation may not be dispatched on, may not be awarded on one or two of the days, and then be fully dispatched on other days. So in cases like that, storage becomes invaluable, an invaluable tool. But I think it also adds to a more liquid same-day market. I know people have talked about there being big bid offer spreads in the same-day market. The more storage providers, the more people with storage out there that are willing to, that have that ability, are more willing to put out bids and offers in the same-day market. So I think it adds liquidity to that market as well. And so I just think storage overall is a big, I think everyone would agree. If everyone had ample storage, they wouldn't have the issues that they're faced with today.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next question I had really was for any of the EIM entities, I guess, that would like to respond to this. We've heard kind of an array of different solutions to help resolve these gas management issues. And so I was kind of breaking them down into at least two of the major themes that I heard. So I was wondering if these issues would still exist if we had more bidding flexibility within the CAISO market, or is this an issue that would always exist due to the timing and the misalignment of timing between the gas and electric markets? And if Joe and Jason, I can't see their hands if they are raising their hands.
Yeah, Lindsay, this is Joe from SRP. If you can hear me, I was just going to speak to the storage question that you previously asked as a follow-up. Again, for Arizona entities, possibly similar to some of the points that the gentleman from Pacificor made, our storage is located out of state. Transportation availability can be problematic same day. Furthermore, we contract for storage really exclusively to meet swings in our retail demand. So once we are in a given day like today, our ability to store or to inject or withdraw gas, we may have already exercised our rights simply to meet load. Storage withdrawal and injection rights really aren't something that we can set aside to ultimately meet wholesale activity. So storage is really not a solution, at least for us. And again, I was kind of speaking to the previous question, but I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, thank you. Well, we can move on then to another question. Let's see. So another, I guess, an approach I was thinking about that we could kind of tackle this issue in the stakeholder initiative is we could kind of go at this one of two ways. And we've kind of seen this in a lot of the different various stakeholder initiatives. Sometimes we dive right into the details and work on specific solutions to kind of resolve these issues, and it gets very technical and detailed very quickly. And so I was wondering if in this specific case, is that something that would be helpful for this specific issue, or should we start at the 1,000-foot level and kind of look at all of the major market design choices that have been made thus far and understand the trade-offs that those decisions have had? Would that be kind of a better approach, I guess, to starting off the stakeholder process for something like this? Or would it be best to just kind of go ahead and get specific enhancements for each of these little issues that everyone's experiencing?
I can take a quick stab. Sanu from Forward Marketing LA. I think a combination of potentially both of those would be helpful. I mean, obviously, you got to know the details of what the issues are to dive into those issues, and you know, as you're looking at the other initiatives that are going on and how resolutions and enhancements in those initiatives will impact the gas imbalance as well. I think we have to all get together and work collectively, keeping in mind both of those issues. There are details in there that are specific to a certain entity, and you know, storage or no storage is one of them. Timeline of you know, what sort of pipelines we're looking at, and those are another one. What sort of group constraints exist for different kind of entities, that's another one, right? So details obviously are going to be important as we come towards a solution, but I think keeping an eye on that bigger picture as well is also important at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to answer? Okay. That sounds good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kaiso to kind of go over their next steps.
Lindsay, could I ask a quick question just to piggyback off your last
Absolutely,
question?
yes.
Awesome. Okay. Josh Walter, Seattle City Light. So assuming that these particular issues, gas deployment, gas scheduling, issues associated with scheduling the electric system schedules versus gas scheduling practices aren't unique to the West. Are there any, to your knowledge or to any information you may have, any examples of other regions, RTOs, or systems that may be a guide to, you know, a better way, or, you know, pieces of other RTOs, business practices that may be a help in kicking off the stakeholder process for this particular issue? Open to anyone.
I actually want to build on that question because my question was related. The gentleman from SRP, I don't remember the name on the phone, made a very good recommendation. NASB, under FERC Chairman Norman Bay, 7 years ago, did request the North American Energy Standard Board to work with the electric sector to come up with some kind of alignment on nominations and requests. And one of the recommendations that's spot on is what 7 years ago was sent to the gas wholesale sector, and they felt it was not an issue back then. And I'm seeing this recommendation back now. So I'm equally curious as Josh, if you know any other Eastern markets they have aligned better or have figured this out. History where the gas sector told the electric sector, no, we don't need to coordinate, we are good.
Maybe that's some research we should do before this all kicks off.
Fair enough.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, does anybody else, I guess, have any other question they'd like to ask quickly?
Any questions online?
We have no questions online at this time, but as a reminder to attendees, you can press the raise hand icon if you do have a question. All right, I'm not seeing any virtual hands raised.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Guillermo Bautista, Director of Market Analysis and Forecasting from CAISO, to discuss his next steps.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay, for the invitation. And thank you for organizing this panel to start having this discussion push forward. I think it's quite relevant to the interest of the market and it's a timely topic to discuss. Before I start with the presentation, I would like just to put a comment about the last question. I think these gas management issues are not unique to California, but for the West, it doesn't help to have these time zones different. That is slightly different to the East. That is a factor to consider. Okay, so I can tell you that we have been exploring, enhancing our markets for the last several years regarding the gas management. We have initiated different policy efforts all the way back to 2014 when we started with the opportunity cost. So we have a long history of exploring a variety of issues impacting the gas resources. And based on that history, we have approached this in a sequential manner. We have multiple series of initiatives to address specific issues at a time. And many of the outcomes that we had from these policies were a balance between positions, a trade-off between concerns. Ideally, we like to be in one side of the spectrum and no issues or downsides, but the reality is that as long as you move anywhere in the spectrum, there are always pros and cons. And this is part of the assessment that we have to do, where we strike the balance. The reason why we have certain tools, certain mechanisms in the market has a history, and we have vetted those through a public open stakeholder process. So I think that history of concerns is going to be very useful when we go forward into this process. And I would like just to summarize, put this catalog of different issues that we have heard through the initiation of the extended day-ahead market discussion, through a specific outreach we did after that, and through this panel. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Everything started with the extended day-ahead market enhancements. Obviously, as we expand the day-ahead market, the natural concern of how we are going to effectuate efficient gas management is a key factor. There has been a series of discussions we have held with different partners in the West, and there is this twofold objective. One is to ensure that we can efficiently dispatch gas resources, taking into account the characteristics, the conditions of the gas market, but also that we have the mechanisms to ensure that resources are able to fully recover their cost. This is a twofold objective that we have always aimed at achieving through the different policy initiatives. And through this discussion, we are dusting off some of the discussions we have through the previous stakeholder processes. The next few slides just capture in a nutshell the different issues and concerns we have heard from the different participants in the West. If we can move to the next slide, please. And I have to say, when we developed different policy initiatives as early as 2013, 14, 15, it was a different world. It was California-centric approach. It was basically the California balancing area. We were exploring to expand into the West energy imbalance market. And therefore, the solutions oscillated around that reference. And obviously, Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California may be in a different position. The structure of the gas pipeline, the storage conditions may be quite different to other areas in the West. That is a reality we have to recognize, and it's a new condition that we have to assess through these discussions. So having that California-centric was useful at the time when we developed the solutions that we currently have. I think it's due to have a revisit of these references. In general, we have heard about the need for flexibility. And flexibility may mean many different things, but in a nutshell, it's about ensuring that resources are able to be in accordingly to the cost that they are exposed. We have a very extended discussion that was potentially the last initiative that we undertook for gas resources. That is called the Commitment Cost and Default Energy Enhancement, the CCDEVI initiative. And we structured a framework that could compromise giving flexibility to resources to reflect their cost and be able to recover this cost versus the concerns of an inefficient dispatch, a competitive market. We came as a reference, as a context, with some flexibility for them to be able to bid up to 125% of the reference bids. Above that, they can actually come and request an extra cost, but they have to go through this process that is, according to what we have heard, very cumbersome to play. And they can adjust the reference bids. So there is a structure, and there is a reason being why we ended up with that structure. We allowed participants to bid between the bid cap and the bid floor. The default energy bids are based on the gas prices that we utilize. They have a buffer of 10% to account for those variability conditions, for those uncertainties that may happen. And one of the big discussions we have, and indeed there was a FERC order back in 2014-15 about the electric gas coordination. And this item aligning the gas and the electric market was purposely discussed and assessed. And there were several factors as to why we didn't change the timeline of the electric market. Part of this discussion has to be whether these conditions are still relevant to the current setup that we have. And we have heard, and we don't disagree. Believe me, we are on the business side supporting the process, and I understand that the manual request process is quite cumbersome. We can explore what options we can have there to provide more flexibility and make it more amenable for utilization. Next slide, please. In another spectrum of the gas conditions, we have specific efforts back in 2014 and 15 to account for what we call opportunity cost. And that was predicated on the limitations of the resources. Whether you have a hydro resource that can produce that much energy, use energy limited, whether you have a gas unit that can start up n number of times in a year, these are very specific count for the resource limitations. At that point in time, there was no exploration about having this opportunity cost for reliability conditions. I think this is one of the items we have heard, whether that will be the feasibility to account for this opportunity cost when the driver is not the nature of the limitation of the resource, but is the utilization for reliability for that resource. Heat rates. Right now, the market optimizes, dispatches resources based on the characteristics, including the efficiency of the gas burn that is captured through the heat rates. These heat rates are passed into our systems. They are carefully validated, and participants do have the ability to adjust, change those heat rates as needed once we go through the validation. It's a type of process that we have in place, some safeguards we have in place to validate the heat rates. What we have heard is that there is a need to have more dynamic, more flexible ability to change these heat rates. That is a factor that we have to further assess, and what are the merits and safeguards we can put to manage these changes so dynamically, as frequently as daily. There may be other conditions, for instance, for fuel zones, right? When we develop the structure that we currently have to account for the fuel cost that is captured through gas prices, we were in this centric approach of the California balancing area back in the early days of the market. And the structure of the gas pipelines effectively require only one gas trading hub. And therefore, our system, our structure was developed around having one hub price. Now that we have a more diverse spectrum of conditions here in the West, we are cognizant that there may be conditions, resources that may be exposed to more than one gas price. I think this is something that we are quite amenable to pursue and see what would be the best solution to get a better outcome of this consideration of the dynamic of the gas prices. Next slide, please. Two more items. One is regarding the gas burn. How we manage the gas limitations. We have also previous efforts to impose, to utilize in the market what we call gas constraints. That was coming from the Aliso Canyon dynamic that we have a few years ago. And right now, the market has the ability to be able to capture specific gas constraints. We have to define what resources, what zones are part of the constraint. We need to get information from this gas company, what is the gas limitation that we have to impose. There are some more nuances in the process because once we have the quota that maybe for the day, we have to find out how we're going to shape the gas utilization. So there are more pieces that play a role in making sure that that gas limitation is effectively internalized in the electric market. And the last one is regarding the alignment of the gas and the electric market. We have an extensive discussion back at the days of the FERC order where we put all the pros and cons of having the change of the timing of the day-ahead market. There were some concerns about losing some accuracy in the forecasting, not just for the load, but also for the renewable resources, introducing other type of risk and variabilities. And these are factors that we still have to assess how relevant they are nowadays when we have this wider spectrum of participation. This is, in a summary, the main items we have heard about gas concerns. Now, if we can move to the next slide, please. I think we have discussed informally and raised the concerns, bring the issues to the surface to the point where I believe we are ready to move forward and move to the next step. We have heard, as you can see, many different angles of different concerns. And in order for us to move forward, we are quite open to entertain and explore with our partners in the West what the solutions could be for those. But I think it's a matter of starting in a very structured way. We have a series of issues, concerns. We have to get this catalog, how relevant these are for all the partners in the West. And we're expecting that we can launch 2 serious workshops. The first one is that maybe we can start checking out all the details, right? Bring all the issues to the surface, make sure that we have the whole list of the issues and concerns that are relevant to the different partners of the West. And once we have this exhaustive list of items, now we can start making the assessment, right? There may be items that we can actually tackle right now. Maybe it's just a business practice manual change, something that is within our provisions to be able to do a change. There may be the other side of the spectrum where we actually have to endeavor a full formal policy stakeholder process, right? It's going to be critical to differentiate which items we can tackle right now, which ones are enhancements versus what we put in a very formal initiative to move forward. This is where we are. We would like to start with these 2 workshops, and that is going to guide us into what was next into the more formal initiative. That is what I wanted to share with you. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Guillermo. I just have one question for you on this. So as you have stated that in the past, CAISO has taken up several stakeholder initiatives to kind of tackle this issue, and the issue has kind of changed or evolved, I guess, over the years. So I was wondering if, since now CAISO is moving to a day-ahead market footprint that expands the rest of the West, would you be willing to kind of approach this issue at kind of a square one basis and put all options on the table? Or are you kind of looking at this to kind of tackle each individual specific issue?
Well, I think it would be premature to jump into what the solution should look like. Part of the way we are structuring this type of workshops is to really shake out the details, right? What are the issues and the relevance of each of the issues to see how we can package this into solutions. So I can tell you that we are quite open to move forward with that discussion that eventually can land in a formal initiative, but we need to approach it in a very structured way to see what items are relevant for the whole community and move forward with those specifically, either as an immediate change or as a formal initiative, because it's still relevant to go back into the history as to why we didn't pursue certain solutions. Even though we are now in a wider footprint, some of those issues may still relevant, right? So we have to shake out all these type of details to decide how we are going to approach this. So I think to answer your question, that still is part of the outcome that we want to get out of these workshops.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay.
And I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself earlier. Vijay Satyal, I'm the public interest sector liaison. Thank you. This is very helpful. It's a comment/question. Your mid-August proposes existing tools. If I'm correct from there was a time when I was deep into the gas sector of understanding the issues. There are some legal questions too about the ability to change scheduling or nomination cycles given how the gas pipeline sector works. So my question/request would be, could your mid-July workshop be one where you compartmentalize what are the trading specific nuances of solutions versus market participation rules of processes versus what is totally legally a challenge? Because I've met a senior executive of a gas pipeline company who always want to remain anonymous on this, but told me that there are legally absolutely some groundbreaking fundamental changes that will need to be made for alignment or scheduling, given how the gas pipeline sector makes priorities for the residential and core customers versus how you might want it to work with the electric sector. Am I correct in my question/my comment?
No, yeah, I think right now we are quite flexible to structure the workshops in a way that is meaningful for everybody participating, right? So we will welcome any feedback that you may have to see how we can more efficiently organize these workshops.
Thank you. Maybe I'm just semantic. I request that it's not be existing tools, it be existing tools or potential new processes. I mean, yeah, because I'm sure the electric sector is sitting on many ideas that they would love to test. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
We are running a little behind, so if there's maybe one more question, and then we'll take a break.
Thanks, George. This is Stuart Kelly representing LA. Guillermo, I appreciate the framework you've presented here for the stakeholder workshop, but I kind of want to jump in a little bit what Lindsay was saying there. I think there's some elements that we maybe need to consider. Much of what you've described falls into the reactionary bucket. And I think there's a fundamental issue that underpins gas forecasting here is we've got to get a better handle on some way, somehow, of getting some kind of gas forecast, or at least a view of the imports and exports that folks can trade off 2 days ahead. We've got to do that. That is the fundamental issue, because if we don't do that, as described by Steve, you'll put bounds on your gas plants, be it an upper bound or a lower bound, of how much that they're going to operate. And as Mike said, coming up to July 4, we're going to trade 5 days ahead. So what does that mean? In a really, really hot day, you have constrained your gas resources and potentially cause a reliability concern because you haven't got a good handle on that gas forecasting. Now, I accept that, it's unlikely the electric, if you bring the electric day forward in terms of when the awards are made available, I do really think that I have huge concerns about the forecasting error that you would see, and there'll be a shift between gas uncertainty to load forecast uncertainty. You may not be better off. So I think the focus has got to be on getting that import-export forecast out there or in some way of understanding what your gas burn is going to be so you have an initial position to trade off. And I think that's the forward-looking element that probably needs to be considered as part of the stakeholder workshop. So we probably need to think about some of those ideas and what needs to fall into that framework before just proceeding with the workshop itself. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think that goes into the spectrum of having that projection that could be a solution like what we propose in the EDAM, like the D+2, D+3. So yeah, these could be tools that we can continue to discuss whether that meets the needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. It looks like we have one question on the phone. So operator, if you could open the lines for the question, and then we're going to take a break after this question.
Yes, this is Mike Florio. I think there is some history here that we can draw upon. When the Aliso Canyon incident occurred, the ISO had to work with Southern California Gas Company and LADWP to come up with some new rules and procedures that dealt with the restrictions on the gas storage in Southern California. It's fairly complex and it might not be a perfect fit for other utilities, but there is some successful history here that I think can be drawn upon. And I believe there were tariff changes needed that FERC approved, and we're just saying we're not drawing on a completely blank slate here. There has been some past success in dealing with gas limitations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Okay, so it's 2:57. We are a bit behind, so let's reconvene in 13 minutes at 2:10. Thank you. 2:10. 3:10.
Okay, can we ask folks to please take their places? We're getting ready for our next panel here. Let's see, I don't know. I don't have a glass, so calling everybody to order. All right, talkers in the back of the room, you either have to take your seats or go into the hall. We're getting going here.
Real quick, operator, we are going to start back in the room if things need to be unmuted.
Okay, thank you. You're already unmuted and ready to go whenever.
Great. So I think next up is the panel on electrification. So I'm Matt LaCar. I am principal with Pacific Gas and Electric Company and the liaison for the participating transmission owner sectors representing the California utilities. And I have a panel with me today of folks with different expertise and different perspectives. So I think it should be a really good dialogue. So I want to harken back to Brandon's initial comments about some of the big changes in the industry. And I thought it was interesting, he mentioned changes in the resource mix on the grid, changes in that we've seen with distributed resources, with climate. One thing you don't hear a lot about is changes in structural changes in the end use demand. Other than maybe the different technologies in lighting that have made major inroads over the last few years, the biggest change in electric consumption in most of our lives occurred in the 1960s, maybe even the 50s, as people adopted new electric appliances in the home. If you think about it, you've probably always had throughout your life a refrigerator, a washing machine, a dishwasher perhaps. electric and gas, electric or gas heating and cooling appliances. What electrification really represents as a trend is a major new change to the end use profile. Customers are now adopting in the form of electric vehicles and to a lesser extent so far, heat pump and induction based technologies, new end use technology that dramatically changes the way they use electricity. And in some cases, it's a fuel substitution, right? If a customer has a gas furnace that they're replacing with an electric heat pump. In the case of electric vehicle, it is a major new appliance that when charging is potentially the size of a home from a load standpoint. So really dramatic for the electric utilities. Certainly as a California utility, we're on the leading edge of some of these changes. I think the California IOUs, we've seen some of the fastest adoption of electric vehicles and plug-in vehicles generally in the world. So for us, it's very real. I think the change is coming at different pace in different places. So that's, we've got some geographical diversity on this panel for you to give you that sense of, okay, when is this tidal wave coming, if it's coming, and maybe it's coming in different places at different times. I would argue also the other analog in many of our career experiences is, we've seen solar and then wind and now wind and then solar and now battery technology on the resource side coming quickly down the cost curve as they've gained scale. And I think the same is likely occurring here. The cost of batteries has come dramatically down over the last few years. That's allowing them to penetrate into markets where maybe electric storage was not a good option for customers, and the same will perhaps occur with other technologies. So with that very simple intro, let me quickly introduce the panel that we have, and then we're going to have about 5 to 10 minutes each of introductory remarks with slides, and then we'll engage in some dialogue out. So we're going to start off with Katie Rogers, who's a senior engineer with WEC. Katie is not sitting around the table because WEC has multiple locations, but Katie is, I believe, ready for us on the phone. So take it away, Katie.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I'm coming at you from Denver. So I just wanted to share a little bit of the case of electrification from a WEC perspective. As Matt said, my name is Katie Rogers. I'm a senior engineer. Let's see, I think I can go to the next slide. Yeah, okay, perfect. So in case there's someone who isn't aware of who WEC is, we are the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. We promote the bulk power system reliability through the Western Interconnection. And there's a map over there that shows the Canadian provinces and the states in the US, and then a little bit of Baja California down in Mexico. I highlighted or bolded, I guess, the word reliability because I know there's a lot of metrics that are looked at when we talk about the grid and things like electrification. And so I want to highlight that WEC's perspective is focused in reliability. Obviously, the other factors matter, but our lens is definitely the reliability lens. Let's see. So my role, why am I here? I'm currently leading a study called the Year 20 Compound Load Impact Study. It's in progress. I wish I had results at this time, but I don't, unfortunately. The proposed publish date is mid-February of 2024. And just for reference, I'm using all sorts of data sources, such as national labs, data from planning entities, or AEO data, and we're using heavily the WEC ADS, which is a 10-year balanced production cost model. This study is focused on electrification in the Western Interconnection and then demand response. And we're looking specifically at the year 2042 and trying to answer questions around reliability, such as when sectors are highly electrified, does that cause a reliability concern? And then if we make assumptions around demand response, could that help alleviate some of those concerns? And I am looking at it from both a generation and a transmission perspective. We're not implementing any transmission planning in our model, but observing line flows and congestion, and just kind of sharing what we observe in the model. So since I don't have results, I'll just share some of the challenges that I'm working through doing this study. I think one of the big ones is that electrification is not happening in a vacuum. And one of the other big components that's changing at the same time is this decarbonization effort. And so not only do we have multiple variables changing, we also have them changing on both sides of the equation, right? As Matt talked about, and as everyone knows, decarbonization is kind of on our side, right? It's on the supply side. We have some control over it. We get to make decisions. We can sign contracts. We can build. We have a lot of control. However, electrification is on the demand side, and I liken it to being a parent where I would love to be able to force my kids into certain behaviors. And if any of you have figured out how to do it, let me know. Otherwise, the best we can do is influence and incentivize a behavior. And we have a lot less control over that, right? So there's a lot more unknowns when we're talking about electrification. And then when you put those together, it just creates a whole host of possible future scenarios. I think it's also important to talk about electrification and demand response together. If we assume that everyone is left to their own devices, they're probably going to exacerbate the peak demand because everyone's going to come home, plug in their cars, and start their dishwashers and their washing machines and turn on their air conditioning units and their TVs, and they're going to behave as we know they do. So we have to consider, do we have enough market depth to serve when those peaks are increasing and by how much they're increasing? And not only that, but do we have the necessary transmission to get whatever resources or generation we need where it needs to be? And then obviously we have to make sure that we can handle that ramp that's happening in that generally evening peak. So then we have to look at what options do we have to try to influence that behavior change through programs or technology. But again, it's really vague as to how much, right? We're reliant on what level of adoption customers are going to take in buying electric cars, what type of electric vehicles, how fast they can charge, who's going to sign up for voluntary programs, who's going to change their behavior based on things like time of use rates, and then how is technology going to change, and what don't we even know yet? I mean, I'm looking out 20 years, and I'm pretty positive we have not seen all of the technology or technological advancements that are going to be here in 20 years. I think it's also important to note that when I talk about demand response, I'm referring to load shift rather than load shaving. I know that there are demand response programs that can help with load shaving, but I think for a widespread solution, we need to be more focused on those programs that encourage a shift of behavior. I know that in general, we tend to think that that means shifting behavior to overnight, but there was a recent Stanford study out that suggested that might not be the best solution, that maybe in the middle of the day is the right time to do that. So the reason we're looking at it from a WEC perspective, which is looking at the whole Western interconnection, here's an example from the Colorado Electrification and Decarbonization Study. And this study specifically is quoted and referenced in the Colorado electrification policies that are being implemented right now. And these three different scenarios show a business as usual scenario, a coal retirement scenario, and then a decarbonization scenario. And you can see that top block, that's kind of a light pink color, that's the imports. And that block is growing as you get further out. And so we need to be looking higher level to say, again, do we have enough generation and enough transmission to support those market needs? Here's another example. Similarly, in California, the California Energy Commission has put together this summer stack analysis for 2022 through 2026. And if you can see, it might be hard to read, the black lines represent two different demand curves. The dotted line represents the expected demand with the industry standard 15% planning risk margin. And the solid black line represents demand with a 22.5% planning risk margin, which is to simulate demand if there are extreme temperatures or high weather or high heat. And as you can see, even in the fairly near term, the resource stack is not meeting that extreme weather curve. And so that obviously creates some reliability questions. And how is that going to change if we continue to add demand or convert demand from other sources into electric demand? I wish I had more as far as results, but like I said, in February of 2024, I'll be publishing my report. Some of my current takeaways, high level though, have been ultimately that this is not a one and done question. This will continue to keep changing. One thing that I've been looking at and thinking about lately is our demand curves are based on a pre-COVID world. And I think we all know that COVID really shook things up. And I don't think we have enough data to know what our demand shape is going to look like going forward. So when I'm looking 20 years out, but using a pre-COVID shape, I don't know that I'm really representing what the load shape even looks like today or next year. In addition to that, obviously we know that policies, unit retirements, adoption rates, the increase in technology, the improvements in technology, and new programs, these are constantly changing. And I think we need to keep considering how each change affects that future question of how we're going to meet those demand obligations. And then obviously the big one is storage. WEC recently, last year, I think it was, published a long duration energy storage paper, and looking at, what types of storage are we going to need, right? I don't think there's one kind of storage or one kind of battery, and we might not have the technology there today, but will we in the future? And what could that technology look like? And how could that help us balance those areas that we're struggling with right now? That's all I had. I don't know if we do questions now or you want to wait till the end.
No, let's hold on to questions and go through the other presentations. Thanks, Katie. And very thought provoking. I'm sure we'll get back to you. Next up, but we're going to highlight some different perspectives on the challenge for the electric grid, migrating, I think, down from the bulk system, regional transmission level reliability issues to the distribution system. And, Stephanie, Seattle City Light is a compact urban service territory, so you can tell us from a distribution operator's perspective what this looks like.
Except I did skip over a lot of the distribution data in these slides, so not to ruin the focus. My name is Stephanie Johnson. I'm a strategic advisor at City Light. I work in our power management division on some of the market initiative work, as well as carbon policy. But I recently completed a 2-year temporary assignment in our electrification and strategic technology team, where I was the project manager for an electrification assessment. And so this is a nice hybridization of things for me this meeting. If you want to go to the next slide, I can start. So as you all know, as decarbonization policies are being instituted, a major question for utilities is whether the grid can support the electrification of things and transportation, particularly for us at City Light. And so we partnered with EPRI to do a year-long kind of wide-ranging study to try and answer this question. And what we ended up with is a really kind of a foundational tool that we're able to pull forward into our future planning processes. So I don't think it's like you pick up that report and that's where the answers are, but it's really informing kind of where we're going next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope of the project, and also I'll cover some of the results and then what we're doing with them. So if you want to go to the next slide. So in an overview, I wanted to cover the scope. I think as the prior presentation showed, there's just a lot of intersecting components in electrification. And so I think we could have like spun ourselves up and worked on this forever and never had an answer. And so we had to kind of contain the work. And so what was in scope for us was doing scenario analysis of electrification and looking at what that impact would be for energy and demand on our system. And then we also kind of did a side-by-side analysis of City Light's existing distribution grid load and capacity. So then we wanted to be able to kind of take a look at them and say, how do these compare, across the year overall? And then how do we start planning and developing policies to figure out how to meet this? And almost as important as what was in scope is what was out of scope. And first, really hard for City Light, where conservation is very important, but we left conservation and demand response out, and that was purposeful for us because we do our demand response potential assessment through a separate process, and we wanted to be able to really take a look at what would the impact of electrification be if we didn't have conservation to offset it, so that we can understand like the true value of what those programs will be going forward. We also didn't do bulk transmission analysis or bulk energy and resource needs. That's work that's being done through our IRP. And so they are incorporating these results into what they're working on. And we didn't look at the cost or the rate impacts. And it's not on the slide, but we also didn't look at climate change impacts. And that is getting worked into some of these later studies. If you want to go to the next slide. I'm not going to spend, there's a lot of information on this slide. It's fully overwhelming. I mostly put it in here. So if you're interested, you could go back and look at the details of what the scenarios were. But the point I want to make about the scenarios we looked at is that the first scenario, moderate market advancement, that was kind of a business as usual look for us with a little bit of escalating electrification. And then the second and third scenarios, these were based on meeting specific targets, emissions reductions targets. And then we did kind of a top-down analysis to do that. And what this ended up providing for us is a bit of a bookend. Kind of what do we anticipate would be the furthest reach of this? And so we had a lot of conversation about like how to approach this, but I think we wanted to start there and then be able to build upon it for the future. If you want to go to the next slide. So part of why I spend a lot of time telling you all the caveats of like what was included and what wasn't and what it was is because of this graph. And this is showing, there's a lot of stuff going on here, so I'll walk you through it. The green squiggly line is showing the projected load under the scenario 2 for City Light in the year 2042. And so that's the 8760 there. And so the orange box is showing that we had a projected peak of 4,415 megawatts. The white box below compares the winter peak in 2019 we had, that was 30 megawatts, and I went ahead and did the math for you. So that shows that we have a projected increase of 2,615 megawatts, which would, increase our load by more than double. And so my response when they first showed this to me was, I think maybe I gasped a little bit and I panicked because I thought we were going to put this out in the public and people were going to run with it. But again, kind of as I mentioned previously, we did want to focus on what could be kind of these bookend cases. And so I added the thought bubble there to remind us that what was out of scope, there's no conservation or demand response. This is assuming kind of like the least smart approach you could have, that it's a 20-degree day, someone drives their EV home and plugs it in at 5 o'clock. And that's not what if we were approaching this, that's not what would be happening. And so I think I want to kind of be able to talk about what we're doing with this sort of result now. If you go to the next slide. So we're moving these forward and taking a more refined look. And so we've taken a look at it in our corporate load forecast for a couple of years, and then we've also incorporated it into our most recent IRP. So in 2022, we had a new IRP come out where our team looked at some electrification, both in the baseline scenario. So our baseline scenario includes kind of overall average load growth with some electrification of building and transportation. And those are the gray bars in the graph. And then they did a bookend scenario using the same scenario 2 from the previous slide. And these are average megawatts and the other ones were megawatts, to be clear. But so this showed, 32% higher use than the baseline scenario. And the value of this for our IRP team is that they're able to use it as a stress test against kind of what they're looking at for baseline resource transmission and policy needs. What would the costs be? How do we start to kind of think about where we are and how it might transition to what's next? And I think notable for this group is that one of the takeaways for our team is that regional energy programs and markets and transmission planning are going to be really important for meeting these changing needs. If you want to go to the next slide. So what's next? I like to say, I think, when we started these presentations a year and a half ago after we got the results, I maybe didn't fully understand kind of the depth of the importance of how this is really shaping what our next questions are. We've engaged with EPRI for some phase 2 analysis where we've done some more detailed work and are taking more of kind of a bottom-up look on these load forecasts and projections, trying to incorporate the specific policies that are being implemented to reach the targets and not just kind of the targets themselves. And so it's informing our planning processes, our policy and program decisions. We, there's that big spike there. So I'm in meetings with our people working on our time of use pilot. And, even if we're not entirely sure how it's going to work right now, we know that we want to be able to have that tool in our toolbox as we're moving forward. So, and I think another great thing that came out of it was that there was just a broad engagement across the utility in some silos and stuff where people don't normally interact. And so we're continuing those conversations and starting to get people to think about stuff in a new way. I talked basically not about the distribution system. I'm happy to talk about it.
No, but here's I just want to start to distill a couple of key messages. I mean, one is that's common to both your and Katie's presentation is, this is a complicated topic that's tightly interwoven with the changes in the resource mix, with climate policy, with TOU rate design. So, and demand response potential. So, full disclaimer, I own an electric vehicle. I also have solar on my roof and a battery. So you can tell what kind of person I am. I mean, I have solar on my roof in San Francisco, which is not the sunniest place in the world. Even though I have a TOU rate from PG&E, I don't necessarily, I drive the vehicle and I charge it when I need it to be charged. And even with the TOU rate, the difference from charging on peak on a sunny day to charging off peak middle of the night, it might be $1, right? But if I need to drive somewhere and I need the full range of the vehicle, I'm going to charge it. And I think we also have to think about the consumer dimension of this challenge. So, to your squiggly chart that was probably an eye popper for your executives, we've seen, similar issues in our service territory for circuits that have, multiple EVs on the same distribution circuit. You are seeing spikes that exceed the current capacity of our distribution transformer, projecting out once you get to a dozen EVs, on some of our circuits, that's going to mean an upgrade all the way back to the distribution substation. And it doesn't take much additional load, especially on a winter night, which is not our traditional peak time, right? The solar isn't available. We're heavily solar dependent in California to meet load. We're going to see not just the sort of beneficial valley filling that makes markets more efficient. We're going to see new peaks and new times that the system may be ill-suited to handle. So I think you've already covered a lot, but there's certainly lots more to go. I'm going to, Joseph's next, so take it away, Joseph.
I was just going to say is I had an opportunity to visit up there in Seattle as well too. And what's really incredible to see is what's really happening there. Talking about the ferries, they're electrifying their ferries up there as well. And so you think about it, the ferry that goes back and forth each day and having to charge up and then also have to turn around fairly quickly as well. That's a huge electrification load too. Along the waterfront as well too, they're doing a lot of electrification changes there. So if you think about it, it's one of the areas where it's incredible just to see the amount of electrification efforts just happening fairly quickly. And so it's really great that you guys did that study. I wanted to talk about that a little bit as well too.
Yeah, I think that that's part of how we're looking at it. It's almost that there are things that are changing so quickly that it's like we are going to continue to see like ticks in our end years in electrification projections.
So that's cool. So I'm going to try and tie it back a little bit together too from what we heard today. My name is Joseph DeGraff Johnson. I work with SRP. I'm a senior product manager. I work on electrification projects. I work on customer programs, essentially, and most of my work is really on the non-road side. We've got a division that does the EV side, but essentially I work really on the non-road side, and I'm seeing a lot of unique things happening on the non-road side as well too. We have, amazing new technologies that are coming up as well too, beyond, when everyone says electrification, automatically you think EVs. You don't think about ferries or industrial processes happening in that direction as well too. And so before we go to the second slide, we're currently in the middle of an integrated system plan. Why we did that is because we see this need growing. We have to get our groups within our utilities together to start to talk about this and map this out as well too. So let's go to the next slide real quick. So early analysis suggests that the integration of tremendous amount of solar and wind will create new challenges for our operational teams. On the slide, you can see our peak day in 2035. And so we've gone all the way to try and model our peak day in 2035. The black line is the projected customer demand and the total system load. The lighter gray area is the portion of the load that is expected to be served by non-dispatchable and renewable resources on the system, solar and wind. The darker gray area is the net load, and the load will need to be served by more traditional dispatchable resources. The net load here looks at a lot at the prototypical duct curve seen elsewhere, and will create similar operational challenges. A shifting peak hour and low carbon, low cost hours in the middle of the day, and evolving challenges create new exciting opportunities for our customer programs. Let's go to the next slide where it gets even more interesting. Give you a second to kind of take a look at that. So as you can see, our programs will evolve over time to place a greater emphasis on peak load reduction to help mitigate some of the operational challenges that we're experiencing. And that will also develop. The ideal world, we want to leverage the energy efficiency and demand response to perfectly shave the evening and overnight hours while absorbing some of the midday solar energy and transportation and building electrification. So what does this mean for electrification standpoint? Today, we encourage overnight vehicle charging with super off-peak rates that run from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. We expect that the super off-peak period will shift to midday in the near future. We also focus on most of our building electrifications on commercial and industrial equipment that charge and operate overnight, like the forklifts, the electric truck refrigeration units. And then through our programs in the midday, super off-peak windows, we expect to focus more on the commercial and industrial process heating loads that can help leverage the lower carbon hours. So you can see, I mean, overall there are opportunities with electrification to be able to shape your peak loads. And so by doing everything from our demand response programs, we're looking at electrification demand response as well too. And so I think the key piece to understand is understanding your load, and then also understanding what are opportunities to be able to shape your load through that peak period. And so I think that that's the key there. Turning it over back to you, Matt.
Yeah, no, that's great, Joseph. Thanks. And thanks for being, tying this all together in a way. I think, the EIM community tends to be focused on markets, and pricing certainly is key to our sensibility. We tend to be, EIM is a very short-term market. With EDAM, we're moving into the day-ahead world. All of us separately live within planning constructs and, system planning that is much longer term in focus. I think this is the kind of chart that sort of reminds you that what we see on a day-to-day basis in the energy market is a function of the infrastructure, the incentives, the consumer demand, that is shaped by those longer term plans. So this is really at the heart of what we do. With that, I want to bring our last speaker into the conversation. So speaking of eye-popping charts, Kavala Consulting, which is a area-based consulting firm, has recently done some work for the California Public Utilities Commission that I know made some headlines and got a lot of people's attention with the potential cost impacts if we don't better manage the implementation, certainly on the grid side of the upgrades and the interconnection costs of all this new load. So take it away.
All right, thank you. A couple of things. I'm really happy to hear the technical term squiggly line. That's what we use inside Kavala as well.
I was going to point out that was the technical term, but I didn't want to embarrass anyone.
Technical term, and we deal with a lot of squiggly lines, which effectively describe behavior, which is really important. So I don't actually think of Kavala as being a consulting company. We have a professional and advisory services group, but we are a platform that does integrated data and analytics. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. There's a lot to cover, but I also want to actually show people the platform so that you can understand what we're really talking about, because it's sometimes hard to comprehend the amount of compute involved. So briefly, by way of background, I'm a recovering regulator. I worked at the California Public Utilities Commission for a little over a decade, mostly on market design issues around capacity markets and high penetration renewables. Transitioned into long-term residual procurement, and in that context got exasperated with the use of a perfectly acceptable spreadsheet tool called Excel, which is totally inadequate for modeling really, really dynamic, distributed, decentralized decisions around investment and behavior of resources. So if we can go on to the next slide. I'll go pretty quick and sort of talk about what the platform that Kavala is, maybe a slide after this even, and then what we did. We built a tool that does three things. It does econometric analysis, it does power flow, and it does integrated machine learning. And it does that in a way that is designed specifically to interpolate through known data sets into areas where there's a great deal of uncertainty across any time horizon, historical, forecasted, typical meteorological year, high, low, or prompt data. And it does this at the device level, at the building level, or across an entire imbalance market if you wanted to do it at that level. Next slide, please. I should also point out that it does this at a really massive scale. It's massively parallelized. So, for example, the work we did in California used 50,000 machines. There's no theoretical limit for how high we can go in terms of the amount of processor power brought to these analytics. But that little triangle I talked about earlier is the foundation for a bunch of different services that run on top of this integrated platform, from integrated grid planning, transportation electrification, project siting, carbon quantification, cyber and national security, and financial services. And all of that sort of gets filtered through the top layer of what am I looking at, what happened, what might happen, how do I share this information, and what's going on right now. Next slide. So you can go to the next slide, actually. What we ended up doing for the state of California, for the Public Utilities Commission, was an electrification impact study, part 1. There will be more. But to start with, we sort of tried to determine in a very hyper-granular way out to 2035 when and where the distribution grid will need enhancements. What do those look like? What are the costs of those things? Sort of how does that percolate up? Importantly, we didn't use we didn't just use the IPER. We looked much more aggressively at some policy-driven electrification scenarios, up to 13.5 million electric vehicles by 2035.
Okay, I'm going to make you spell out. So IPER, for those who don't live in California regulatory world, is the Integrated Energy Policy Report
something like
of the California Energy Commission. So for all you non-California energy geeks, that is the state's approved planning forecast for load going out over the IRP horizon.
Which everybody is required to use, and it makes sense to coordinate in that regard. But also, because it is an economic adoption model, misses some of these policy-driven decisions that might significantly increase, as an example, the adoption of electric vehicles.
So California-centric. Thank you.
I will point out IPER is just one of my favorite ETLAs, which are extended 3-letter acronyms, which I recommend everybody use as much of as possible. So the end result of that was this address-specific, very robust scenario analysis that then is pushed into power flow that then identifies where capacity expansion is required down to the service transformer level. And the end result is pretty big number, which is unmitigated electrification of transportation distribution grid impacts up to $50 billion by 2035. Short takeaway from that is the number doesn't have to be that big. This is unmitigated. It also doesn't represent full electrification of transportation because it's only up to 2035 and 13.5 million vehicles. And it also doesn't represent other forms of electrification, building power, industrial processes, et cetera, et cetera. But where we are going next is mitigation, and we'll talk a little bit more about all these things, but if we could go to the next slide. We started with forecasts of net loads, and then we determined where overloads occurred down to the service transformer level, and then we added additional capacity to address those needs, and then identified costs associated with those things. So this is actually assigning not just load and load growth, but load growth net of probable DER adoption based on econometrics associated with payback periods for different customer classes and the like, and then pushed all of that into thermal limits for all of the data. I should point out, by the way, there's a lot of data involved here. There was a data request that the PUC submitted to the 3 investor-owned utilities in California. So this was full distribution network circuit models for all circuits, address-specific AMI data, rates, and customer class information, the location of every DER, and SCADA data to normalize everything.
That's a quick clarifying question. Was this data confidential? Because this is serious bread and butter utility data. So the commission, of course, can keep access to it, but was it under confidentiality and?
Yeah, it's not Cavala's data. This is all analysis done on behalf of the California Public Utilities Commission as part of its evaluation of the investor-owned utilities distributed resource planning proceedings.
Thank you.
We do provide services to utilities where we're not working on behalf of the regulator and provide those same services directly to utilities, but that was not the case in this instance. Next slide, please. So we just focused on sub-transmission down. This did include secondary transformers, but not service drops. But it did go all the way down to those service transformers. We have the ability to and do model the bulk power system and generators on that. But that was not part of the scope of this work. Next slide. And this is kind of another version of the same thing, but probably the interesting piece here is that it's going to describe the math involved, where basically you start at a service transformer, work your way up to overloads into the feeder, work your way up to transformers in the substations. Once you run out of transformer banks, you need a new substation. And things get a lot more expensive, but that's the general logic that the capacity overloads were modeled. Next slide. We ingested a lot of data. I already talked about most of that. This is all based on historical AMI data normalized for weather at the address specific level and then run through for typical meteorological year planning purposes. On out, it includes all of the programs and DERs as referenced earlier. That produces a net load baseline. Then there are modifiers as new DERs or programs are implemented, and you end up with the net load impact at the end. Again, for multiple scenarios at the address specific level, producing monthly bills, DER adoption over time that's sized to the payback period, and then both generation and load profiles, including electric vehicle transportation that is localized to light duty, medium duty, heavy duty, as is appropriate for the region. And you can play around with what that looks like based on dwell time and vehicle range and the like. Next slide. As referenced earlier, this ultimately cascades up into the bulk power system, and the intent here is really just to emphasize the idea that, and I think this is probably the most interesting takeaway, aside from the fact that there is a very large amount of electricity that is coming. One of the challenges that I think we are facing broadly as planners is the mismatch between the time horizon that distribution planning occurs and would typically signal to the transmission planning process, hey, we got a problem here. The rate of change that we are seeing as a result of electrification of transportation in particular is such that it's quite likely we're going to end up in a situation where the transmission system becomes the constraint for electrification, because the distribution system couldn't signal when and where the load was coming in an appropriate time period to get transmission built in time or some version of that. So I just want to flag, we often think about the generation side of the equation on the bulk power system, but there's quite a lot of uncertainty that is going to be coming as a result of electrification, not just of transportation, but buildings broadly. And as constraints on the distribution system become significant in terms of impediments to allow for interconnection of this new load, that will change the shape of the distributed energy resources these customers adopt in, which will all be FERC Order 2222 compliant and have the ability to participate in wholesale markets in ways that will be radically different as a result of the constraint on the distribution grid that inform the size of these systems. So the system is about ready to get a lot more complicated and need to get a lot bigger all at the same time. Next slide. Sorry, you were, with that last point, you were speaking specifically to a market impact, which we're all, kind of here for. So I'm imagining you're talking about things like sub-LMPs from a pricing perspective for how customers may be able to have some level of ability to participate in the markets or have some level of cost recovery mechanisms. So the last thing I want to do is get out in front of really complicated market design issues in like a 5-minute presentation, but I think that the point that I'm really trying to make here is that the shape of these resources is going to be highly geographically variable, and those shapes are going to inform the way they participate in other opportunities, right? So
yeah,
that's really the key.
I actually had a different reaction, Josh, but it's good. Like Aram is giving us this like Rorschach test of like, you're throwing a lot of information at us and we're all seeing different, parts of the elephant. So distribution planning, if you're a customer on a congested circuit in an urban part of our system, for example, tends to be, older infrastructure with less headroom for new load. You come along and say, hey, PG&E, I want to interconnect this shiny new electric vehicle I just parked in my garage and upgrade my circuit. Can I install a bigger house level main, put in a new panel? And we say, we're going to have to upgrade your service transformer. You got to wait 6 months. That's not a good outcome, but 6 months is perhaps not too long to keep charging that shiny new vehicle on a older, 110 volt, and maybe finding public charging. What if I come back and say, actually, it's not just the service transformer, it's the whole substation, and we've got a 5-year planning horizon to put in a new substation. What if I come back and say it's 10 years because we're going to have to upgrade and build a new transmission line, right? So nobody wants to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that's the issue is peak capacity planning is always based on that, like the last customer in is going to be the one that has to wait. So that's what I took away.
Yeah, I mean both of those things simultaneously as a Rorschach test designer. And so let me just further complicate things a little bit more. Another thing that we do is power flow based carbon intensity, which we think is where the market is going to move as we see weaknesses in RECs as penetration levels get higher. And what that means is that you're going to get a lot of entities because their aggregators care about these things. I would focus in particular on OEMs in the mobility space here, but there are many other examples. We'll start optimizing charging based on carbon intensity of delivered power. And I am not aware of anybody that's doing transmission or bulk power system planning right now that's thinking a lot about what happens when load starts swinging based on highly variable the carbon intensity of delivered power that might affect decisions like charge here now or charge there later. As an example, because an OEM has a scope 3 reporting requirement that they're starting to think a lot about.
So can I ask on that one? Just, and I want you to get a chance to finish your great remarks, but also kind of segueing into a little bit of the discussion because Josh started it. Thank you. This is really meaty stuff, and we probably all want to dig into it. But so we think of like consumers in general tending to react to price signals and rate-based incentives first, and maybe some of these other dimensions. So, for example, I have a vehicle. I can charge it at home on a residential rate. I can charge it at my workplace, perhaps. And even if they do charge me for charging, even if they do ask me to pay for the electricity that goes into that vehicle, if it's on the commercial parking lot at that office space, it may be charged a commercial rate, right? So already a lower price of electricity. And if it's a mobile load, right? If I take it to some fast charging station on the interstate, it might actually be an industrial rate because there's so much load at that location that it gets an even cheaper rate. It's directly served off transmission, perhaps. So we haven't had to encounter this in the electric industry before. These are mobile loads that are going to chase the best rates. So yeah, I mean, you know, maybe if we start pricing carbon down to the lap, you know, down to the load, the node on the grid, we'll have a carbon-based price signal that consumers will chase. But actually, I think the near-term likelihood is what I described, which is kind of rate arbitrage.
All of the technologies that intermediate retail rate structures are have declining cost curves, right? Like it just gets cheaper to intermediate retail rates, no matter what it is. You come up with some solution, it is going to be arbitraged by somebody. I think that you made a reference to large scale load, and I think it's a really important thing, is that in some instances, there's going to be batteries there because of a constraint that limited the size of that interconnection. And there may be places where it's desirable to go because you can fast charge on low carbon at the same time. So meaning that might have charged during the day when there was a lot of sun.
My hypothetical freeway fast charging station has a solar farm next to it and a big battery, and the battery time shifts to solar so that whenever I pull up my 18-wheeler, I can fill the tank with clean energy and get, you know, some of that. Am I painting the picture?
Basically, yeah. And let me just say that there are some utilities that we're working with now that are starting to think about imputed cost of carbon in both planning and program, as well as rate design, so that it's likely that as the ability to sort of internalize the point on the horizon that we're all trying to get to from a decarbonization perspective, that more and more decisions are going to be built around, well, does it make sense for me to, I live in a high solar penetration area. Does it make sense for me to build out workplace charging distribution infrastructure to support that, rather than biasing towards home charging that might be a higher carbon intensity because the utility themselves have scope 1 and 2 reporting requirements?
Yeah, and I kind of changed the example from a residential to an 18-wheeler, but you can imagine fleets, right? There are lots of corporate electricity consumers who have also large fleets of passenger vehicles, pickup trucks, delivery vehicles, right, that come back to a central depot or parking lot, and they can all, you know, as they convert to electric charging, potentially either be huge new electric loads, and or, you know, if there are distributed generation resources and storage resources at those locations, you know, be beneficial to a decarbonization goal. So, Joseph, if you want to.
Yeah, I want to tie back to, I think, you know, when I think about all this, this is a lot for my brain. There's no doubt about it in terms of just what's happening with electrification. But I also think that in terms of the conversation, as you know, you guys folks are looking at, you know, the pricing piece as well too. It is really important that there are discussions with the different groups. I mean, when we took on the integrated systems plan, we brought different groups in together to have that conversation. When does it cost the most to operate? When does it cost the most to, when does it cost the least to bring our systems down? What are some ideas in terms of programs that we can provide to kind of reduce strain on that part of the system as well too? It's a conversation that can be handled by groups individually. It's a conversation that you have to look at the entire utility, or it's, in this case, you may even look at a sector, bring sectors together to have that conversation. Like, we have our peaks at this time, we have our peaks at this time, right? There's only so much power we can generate and borrow from each other as well. And so I think that the key piece is having that conversation. What are some of the things that we can do to kind of ramp up for this, right? And I think the conversation that you had, you mentioned that, hey, is it someone charging at home or is it someone charging at work? Do we build infrastructure in the middle of the freeways, you know, for everybody to be able to charge that way too? There are a lot of ideas that are like, charging sometimes during the day to relieve that peak that's going to shift later on. And so I think it's almost like we're trying to figure out what's coming in the future and then trying to say, oh, so we could do this now. It's sometimes they're kind of button heads a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, this is a classic planning challenge, right? There's sort of the no regrets investments that you make today based on, there's a range of sensitivities and I know my future is going to fall somewhere within that band. Mm-hmm. And then when you see disruptive change in a market like this, it's outside your band and you go, oh my God, I need to build, massive new infrastructure. If I assume unmitigated, right, the world of tomorrow looks like the world of today plus 13 million electric vehicles, or on the contrary, right, and I wanted to tie in something Katie mentioned about COVID, right? We had this disruptive change in many of our daily commute lives, right, where suddenly people who used to get in a car at 7 or 8 a.m. every day to go to an office park somewhere, and that vehicle had a drive pattern and a charge pattern that you would associate with it, all of a sudden is gone, right? Many of us are still working from home or hybrid a few days a week, and that vehicle pattern that you would have expected to see is completely different. Another technology piece is coming. Many of the auto OEMs are playing with new battery technology that has much larger driving range. So when I think about the balance of public charging infrastructure versus charge at home or charge at the workplace, if today I have a relatively old Nissan Leaf that has 100-mile range, if I go anywhere outside my immediate San Francisco bubble, I probably have to charge it. But if a new vehicle comes along that has a 600-mile range, that's a full day's driving. There's nowhere I'm going to go in my daily life, as an unplanned or, oops, I need to charge all of a sudden, that's going to take, even half of that away, right? So with that, once the vehicle ranges get bigger, the range anxiety that drives the need for this public charging infrastructure today probably also diminishes. And the charge infrastructure you might only see at, say, hotels or along, major interstates where people drive very long ranges. So there's a lot at play here. It's, and I appreciate, Aram, you've done a great job kind of teeing up the discussion. So I don't want to cut you short if you have one or two more slides, maybe?
I have one more slide. I was hoping to be able to show a quick demo, but my sharing permissions are a little weird right now. So I think maybe in the interest of getting to the meat of talking about squiggly lines, we should go from there. I should point out that the platform is designed to be much more robust than what we've talked about. So you can design rates and look at rate impacts and a lot of things along those lines, as well as do benefit cost analysis down to the device level and non-wired alternatives and a whole bunch of other things. The direction that we see the market moving is that, and the reason why the study was structured in particular around 2025, 2030, and 2035 is 2025 is very squarely in the distribution planning time horizon wheelhouse, and expect traditional distribution planning upgrades to function in that mechanism. 2035, we got time. We'll build some transmission. We'll get it figured out. 2030, not so much. Right? 2030, you're going to be running into these constraints. You do not have time to build transmission out by 2030. And so the question then becomes, what do you do? And that is designed to help us collectively as an industry get to a place where we start to say, well, how do we change behavior? How do we incentivize behavior? How do we, maybe the right mechanism is to say, I really need this behavior in this area, probably for 7 years. Is that enough to pay for the infrastructure that somebody behind the meter is going to invest in? How do you appropriately incentivize that? How do you push out the time horizon for distribution planning to actually think about those kinds of things? And then understand that that resource may behave totally differently. Again, maybe looking at imbalance markets and say, now that I'm not constrained by this distribution constraint anymore and not obligated to act in this particular way as a result of some distribution capacity payment I received or program incentive, whatever it may be, I'm going to behave in a totally different way now. And what does that then mean for the larger market?
I think, Matt, you brought up an interesting thing is that as, we look at these vehicle charging, right? The average person is not charging every day. They're charging once or twice or sometimes 3 times a week. And like Lucid's now up to 500 miles, right? So a Chinese company called BBD is looking at 1,000 miles in terms of charging as well. And so I think, in terms of when we look at the future in terms of loads, right? We have to look at the loads in terms of technology that's coming forth as well. And I think that, again, that was the decision, I think, that some of the utilities were like, whether or not are we going to put charging stations everywhere, or else maybe we hold off and maybe we concentrate on workplace charging as well. And so those conversations are actually occurring right now as we speak, in terms of the integrated system plan again. And so I think it's, this is more emphasis on the fact that we need to kind of get beyond our silos and kind of talk with the different groups that we're involved with, or the different, kind of utilities as well too.
So, do you want to introduce what we're looking at?
Just really quickly, we did get this sharing set up. Thank you to the moderator who helped me here. I just wanted to point out, this is one 24-hour period using publicly available data in an organized wholesale market, not too close to here. Shape is probably pretty recognizable. But if you just look at the geographic variability and carbon intensity over the course of one day, and you start to ask the question about, do I charge at home or in my office? You can start to imagine that this is just one day, and then there's seasonal variations. And, as you move more broadly, it is entirely likely as we start to think more about imputed cost of carbon, that we're going to see behavior that doesn't follow traditional, what we think of as now common sense approaches to these things. The last thing I want to do really quickly is just explain what we're really talking about when we say we're doing this stuff at the address specific level. This is all publicly available data. I'm not showing proprietary information here, but if we zoom in to the point where we start loading rooftop PV systems identified from computer vision algorithm and looking at distribution circuits, and then load all of the parcels associated with those, and then take those individual parcels and do analysis at the address specific level. I'm going very quickly here and I apologize. I can take all of that information, I can roll that up into through demographic information, through historical or interpolated load to produce 8760s. Those 8760s of demand then can be modified by doing things like looking at load growth for particular customer classes or building, adding electric vehicles or heat pumps or batteries and the like, and then calculating a bill. I invented a rate here called Really Cool Rate, which I recommend everybody adopt if they can get it. All of that is then going to result in, I would have to actually save the name of this scenario in this particular instance. It's going to produce a new bill and a new load profile for this customer, and then be pushed into power flow inside the tool. So because this is a parallelized process, we're doing this on 50,000 machines or 100,000 machines, and you can run for everyone. All I did was do load growth of 1% here, so it's not very exciting. But you can start seeing what happens if you get some customers that have 2 EVs and only 1 charger and the like, to start pushing this into the power flow where you actually pop service transformers and overload.
Yeah, so that's actually a question I wanted to pose to the group, and I'll start with you, Arm, which is, you've got all this granularity in your tool. One of the interesting observations we've had, a lot of the early adoption of technology tends to be affluent, green-minded consumers. There's a demographic element to where these loads are starting to appear, right? So in PG&E service territory, we have suburban areas. Often people have 2- and 3-car garages. There's relatively newer infrastructure. The predominant pattern is single-family home ownership, right, rather than multifamily buildings. So a lot of advantages electrically when you start to see electric vehicle load popping up in those neighborhoods, which is, we have headroom on the system to accommodate a vehicle or 2 per circuit. When we've seen adoption migrating into some of the older built-up areas that have older equipment, less headroom, and potentially consumers that have different charging patterns because they may not own their own garage. They may park on the street. They may have a multifamily parking area under the building where all of the parking is shared by all of the tenants, or they have to, convince a landlord to put in an extra charger, right, to accommodate a vehicle. So I guess the question is it safe to extrapolate based on these early adopters, what the trends are going to be? What do you think the demographics will look like 5 and 10 years out as, EVs, assuming they become mainstream, and they kind of are?
The good news is that you don't have to base this on historical behavior anymore. There's actually really good tools. The CEC in California and some of the national labs they partnered with have built some really great tools. EV Pro, as an example, or Heavy Pro. These are really good modeling engines. They're open source. You need to develop some subject matter expertise to use them. There are things like transit analysis zones that do a very good job of describing the source and sink of commute patterns and probable arrival and departure times. And all of these things can be pushed into planning tools, but you sure can't be using traditional peak-oriented planning because it's just is gonna tweak everything. There is an anecdote that I have heard told, not by the person at SMUD, but by somebody who worked with them, that the distribution planner looked at his service transformer and discovered that it peaked on Sunday afternoon in the winter. And he was like, this doesn't make any sense. And then he realized, well, when 4 of your neighbors go up to Tahoe and have EVs, your service transformer peaks at 4 in the afternoon in the winter because you're coming back Sunday, you come back down the hill and everybody charges. So there's a lot of stuff that is counterintuitive. But as you sort of push this into engines that have the ability to describe diversity of commute patterns, diversity of demographics, reliance on public transportation or not, you will get enough variability in there to actually look at things. I've done some work recently in Hawaii, and it's really easy math in Hawaii because people don't go between islands and cars, right? You have really good constrained solutions. That where Hawaii gets more complicated is in fuel switching. When you start shutting down gas stations and the ability to actually bring in an appropriate level of gasoline to keep it economic. And so what we actually think is going to happen in some of these markets is you're not going to see the S-curve that you would normally assume, because fuel switching actually significantly increases the cost of ownership, and total cost of ownership models for EVs are very low compared to trying to maintain combustion-based engines, as there are less and less service providers and more expensive fuel.
Right, so you could get into a death spiral. So I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I'm going to pivot to that. Do we have any questions in the web queue? Let's start there. And folks in the room, you can think if you have a question you'd like to ask. Okay, so I got VJ. Operator, are there any questions in the queue?
I do have one hand up on the virtual line.
Let's go to that first.
All right, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Jerry Melcher with the Public Advocate Office. How you doing, Aaron?
Hi, Jerry. I'm doing well, thank you.
Okay, we've all survived COVID, so that's a good thing. Do you have anything in your model that factors in competition by consumers putting in their own generation because of the cost of electricity? We looked here recently at the cost of rates in San Diego, and they're 45, 55, 66 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on if you're on a TOU rate or a block rate. And we're looking at the DG stats. Looks like we're heading to we're over at 1.5 million behind the meter customers with solar, and it looks like we got a 15% growth rate. Is that factored into any of your models?
So the econometric portion can optimize against any economic analysis. So as long as there's a cost associated with the DG resource, it gets selected based on the distribution within a geography. And that technology is right-sized for the load and the economic payback period at the address specific level. Now, I don't know the specifics of what resource you would be talking about to know if it was specifically included, but the model isn't that smart. It doesn't care. It will take whatever you tell it to consider.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, in California, we have Title 24. We've had, you know, zero energy homes since 2022. Starting at 2024, we have to have zero energy new buildings or even upgrades to old buildings. So I was wondering, do you know if the CEC is factoring any of that into your forecast?
Jerry, I'm going to cut you off because this is a regional forum. So save your California specific questions for Aram when he shows up at the PUC, and you can.
It's a very good question for the whole region because wait a minute. It's a very good question for the whole region because people get, you know, 30% tax credit, and the commercial construction is eating into everybody's business. Okay, they're taking load off. So everybody's sitting there factoring in this huge load growth, but the question is there a model that says, hey, we do have competition? So I don't know. That's just what I need to factor in to see if anybody's thinking about that going forward. Thank you. I'll get off.
I think where it gets more interesting is when you start looking at building electrification, right? Because especially the shape of heat pumps as a squiggly line, they're actually not very squiggly because they stay on for a long period of time, for extended periods of time in the weather environments that we're looking at. And in those instances, the way I characterize it is the demand for electricity under the roof far exceeds the roof's ability to offset in any meaningful way. And so you will still end up with very large upgrades triggered by.
When I was talking before about peak shifting seasonally to winter nighttime load, right? Not only do you have the issue of the sun tends not to shine at night, but you actually don't even have solar. The solar hours are much shorter in a winter day, and you don't, even if you have a big battery, have enough energy to store up and charge a whole ton of vehicles during a winter night. So there are real physical constraints to the DG as a direct substitute for grid electricity. What we tend to find is, and I can speak for myself, most solar customers, residential solar customers, still use the grid as a big battery, right? When the sun isn't shining, they're counting on the grid to be there. That means, you know, the squiggly line gets more and more squiggly. Vijay, your question.
I have a two-part question. This is Vijay Satyal, Public Interest. And it's mainly, no disrespect, Aram, your stuff is pretty cool. It's a pretty fancy, cool toolbox. I'm glad the commission could afford to do this work. My question is more directed to the two utilities here. And I'm channeling a speaker who couldn't be here today, Phil Jones, former Washington commissioner. And I can quote him because I know he said this very publicly. A big tsunami is coming. Car companies are getting ready to make massive amounts of EV and are prepared to come to the commissions and engage to demand charging the electric charging infrastructure be available very easily across key sensitive transportation nodes. So my question for you guys is, what would you want to be able to be ready to have ease of electrification? I get it, you need ratepayer support. I get that part. We all know that. Without money, nothing will happen. But how are you dealing with transportation as a priority for electrification versus what Matt was speaking about is electrification happening in the homes, and maybe the codes are not available, or old buildings like this, or my office building, I have offered to work with the landlord to put in the Rocky Mountain Power incentive, which covers 50% of the cost, and he's still not interested when we have 4 EVs in that building. Plus Tesla's come off and do a nice restaurant. So it's a two-part question. Consumer versus transportation electrification, how are you dealing with that? Or what's the threshold for deciding your problems?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you want to go first?
How are you dealing with the reality of massive transportation electrification
versus
that is needed versus?
I think, I was trying to demonstrate on the chart that we know that it's coming. So what we're doing is essentially we're trying to plan ahead on the EV side. And again, we're looking at where the peak loads are going to occur, and then trying to see whether or not to incentivize charging to happen sometime during the day, as opposed to that super peak that we have at night as well. So there's different types of customer programs that you can run to be able to shift behavior, right? And I think Kathy said in the first part of it was, it's like you're trying to change, your kid's behavior, trying to mold your kid behavior. But by the time my kid is grown, I'm still trying to do that behavior. My kid's going to be grown in 12 years. And so 2035, 12 years from now, right? How's that? How are these different shifts? And it can't always come from, customer programs. It's also got to be, there's a price there. Is it cheaper for this to occur? The customer is going to try and shift to that time period that's cost is low as well too. And so I think that, for us, how we're meeting it is through demand response programs. It's through different types of customer programs as well too. Pricing as well. There is the load component. We're going to have to grow our loads. We're also going to we're going to bring on more loads as well. But I think it's the component of that. And I think that that's why, the first thing I introduced was essentially we have that integrated system plan, because we know that these things are coming. And so we're bringing all the groups in to kind of sit there and discuss it and see if we can, as it's coming up, we're trying to hit it each and every year. So that's what.
Can I say one thing about children? Just remember, it is the hubris of the adult that thinks that there's only teaching flowing in one direction. They're exceptionally good at teaching adults with their behavior, and that is happening in our industry as well.
All right, I think that's a great message to end on. Were you going to?
I was actually going to. Okay, so City Light has, the electrification and strategic technology team, they have a team working on transportation electrification, and we did a bunch of work to do a strategic investment plan around that. And so we did a big part of that, and the piece I wanted to touch on is a huge piece for us was equity. And they did a lot of outreach with the different groups in different neighborhoods, the community. It was a huge focus of that effort. And I think that that's really one of the things we're having to learn as a utility, right? Is how are we actually engaging the communities to not kind of recommit the same things that we've done in the past, where we've haven't necessarily taken all of that into consideration. So I think that's a huge piece of it for us.
I have been told that we're going to capture, we're about 5 minutes behind, and we were going to take a 5-minute break. So
we are going to go straight through. So thank you very much for a super.
Let's thank the panel.
Fun. Yep.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks to Katie. I know you're still there somewhere.
As we transition off this panel, our next update is coming from Kit Blair with Avangrid, giving us a rundown of their EIM implementation and how things have gone thus far. So let us transition real quick at the front of the room and give us a couple seconds.
All right, so I'm Kit, and I want to thank the RIF leadership, Josh and Lindsay, for inviting me. I know you guys went to WAPA and El Paso first, and they said they're too busy, but then came to Avangrid, and so we're here. That's right. And thank you to the Board of Governors for being here. Something sort of interesting about this, and you're going to learn a few things actually in this presentation. Is that we were the first generation only BA to join, which actually brought a number of unique challenges to the process, and I think was a learning experience for both the ISO and of course certainly for us through that. So I actually did go back and review the old presentations of onboarding, and we're not going to talk about all those things that we all experience as joining EIM. We're going to talk about just some the unique things about us. So can we go to the next slide? So one of the things is we're probably not as well understood as maybe some of the other players around here. So I'm going to just briefly touch on who's Iberdrola and who's Avangrid, and our company, and what is the Avangrid BA, because it's a very different animal than a lot of normal BAs. Talk about our very compressed timeline that we willingly did, and then the actual piece of the onboarding. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so who's Iberdrola and Avangrid, and you can forward to the next slide. Iberdrola is we're a massive worldwide utility with operations across Europe and Spain, Australia, Brazil, the U.S., and the United Kingdom, and so it's a very big company. It's the second largest utility in the world, we have a lot of experience in all kinds of technologies, and it's a massive industrial company. Next slide. So just a few interesting things. So Iberdrola, we have 40,000 employees. It's 175 billion invested assets. We own and operate nuclear, large-scale pump storage, battery storage, and of course a lot of renewables. We're operating about 60,000 megawatts of generation worldwide. And Avangrid is part of that. We're a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange, and the majority of the float is owned by the Iberdrola Group. And so it's a holding company, and we have a bunch of what we call networks or poles and wires businesses in the Northeast. So in the Northeast, similar to ERCOT, it's different than out here. The utilities don't own and operate generation with limited exceptions. You're essentially a distribution company. So we have a number of those. We're in the process of acquiring Public Service of New Mexico, which might quite possibly be the longest engagement in utility merger history. So it just got delayed again, and now we're looking at sometime in 2024 for that, if that does in fact happen. And just another interesting factoid is we're very big in offshore, and my company is building the first large-scale offshore plant in the United States off the coast of Massachusetts. And in the company, in all its wisdom, is going to hand me the keys to a $2+ billion investment to operate Vineyard Wind out of Vancouver, Washington, where we have our control center. So I'm neck deep in offshore. I'm learning a lot about it, and it's it's wild if you want to talk about it and everything about it. I'll offer one observation though. Offshore on the West Coast, after now being fully involved in it, I'd say there's a lot of optimism in those timelines around that offshore and on the West Coast, given what we're experiencing. And that's, of course, is deep water. We're not even deep water. But anyway, we'll move on. Next slide. Okay, so what is the Avant-Grid Balancing Authority? Because I think this is kind of interesting for folks, and we're structured very differently than a normal VA. You can go to the next slide. So where are we? So we are contained within the states of Washington and Oregon, and what this slide represents is all of our operations across the U.S. So I operate in every market in the U.S. And my team has to understand how all the markets across the U.S. operate, and they're all quite different and have their strengths and weaknesses, and we have a lot of perspective around that. And there's always a crisis in my control room because right now there is record loads happening in ERCOT. Prices are $5,000, and I have a big operating fleet there. So there's always something happening around the country that we're managing and dealing with, and trying to keep it between the lines, which means it's always intense and never boring. But we are spread across the U.S., but the BA operation is only in Washington, Oregon. It's the only balancing authority operation in the entire Iberdrola group. So that can be a challenge trying to explain up to the higher ups in Spain what the hell it is we're even doing in there. We began our operations in July of 2018, and we had the privilege. If you think it's difficult changing reliability coordinators, imagine onboarding with a reliability coordinator that knows it's going out of business. And so this was at the time that peak reliability was imploding. And so I had to onboard with peak reliability and then immediately pivot and go to RC West. So that was quite an experience to go through that. Interesting point on that though, I got to know Marie Jordan very well. And I was able to cut a deal with her, and we now, our control center is in the former Peak Reliability Control Center in Vancouver, Washington. So we stepped right in after they left, and that worked out really well for me. It's a great facility, and anyone's welcome to come and visit us. Next slide. It was a great deal, actually. A lot of you paid for it. Okay, so when you think about the Avant-Grid BA, you've got to think about it. Actually, Bonneville coined this term, the centroid, when we were originally doing the self-supply program, and then we transitioned into a BA. So I do not own and operate transmission. I buy lots and lots of transmission from BPA, but all of our generation is either interconnected to Bonneville or to PacifiCorp. And so we have points of interchange where we have collections of resources that sit behind those, and then we go on to Bonneville's transmission system, and then that's how we move the energy around the West and to our customers. So we have both, dispatchable and non-dispatchable resources in that, but I'm not a transmission operator. Next slide. So one of the reasons that just sort of as a owner operator developer in the Northwest that I can even do this, because you don't hear my competitors doing this, is we have a huge transmission portfolio, a legacy transmission portfolio that goes back into the days of PPM Energy and has rolled over since. I have over 1.1 gigawatts of intertie, AC, DC into California, and a tremendous amount of west of Cascades and other really valuable transmission that allows us to build assets because when RFPs come out, the utilities, of course, they want this energy to be delivered to their system firm. And so if you can't even meet that original hurdle, then you're probably not going to get selected in their RFP. And so we continue to build and operate because we have a transmission portfolio that can support that. Next slide. Okay, So my reality today is what a lot of your reality is coming tomorrow. So I have a huge amount of variable generation, non-dispatchable, what we call in my system. So 70% of the installed capacity in my BA is renewable and variable generation. It's comprised of wind and solar. So 1.6 gigawatts of wind, half a gig of solar. I do have a combined cycle and peaking facility, and then I have some contracted hydro under long term, so about 3.1 gigawatts. So right now my combined cycle is on its spring outage for overhaul. It'll be coming back here soon. We'll talk about that in a minute. So with that offline, my actual variable generation can go up to 90% of my balancing authority. And so that is a really, really high penetration of renewables. And so there's, we've gotten very good at it, but it's not easy. Next slide. Okay, so the compressed implementation, and I'm actually going to talk about a little anecdote here. You can go to the next slide. So if, for those of you, if you go back into your days of when you onboarded onto EIM and, you know, you're told repeatedly by the ISO, minimum 18 months. Okay, you must do this in 18 months, no less than that. They take your go live date and they backdate it 18 months, and that's what you need. And that was good advice. And it would have been great if I could have followed it. We were going through some management changes, and you know, I was the project sponsor, and I believe very strongly that we had to do this. Basically become existential threat to our BA due to the, lack of liquidity happening in real time and such, that we really needed to get into the EIM. And it was really tough and terrible that we did not go live when Bonneville went live. So that really, the last year resulted in some deep inefficiencies for us. But we kind of got stuck in this sort of bring me a rock exercise where, it's like executives say, well, bring me a rock on, kid, bring me a rock. And they don't tell you, how big a rock and what does that rock look like and what kind of rock and what time, and all those things. And so we kind of got stuck into this. And I remember being in December of 2021, I was in Steamboat Springs, Colorado on vacation. And we were going to have yet another meeting on whether or not we're going to do EIM. And the ISO is frustrated at this point. We left them at the altar several times and not said I do. And so we were, and to their credit, I had a lot of conversations with ISO staff and explaining the internal challenges that we were having, and the ISO never gave up on us. So I really appreciate that. And but we were at December 2021, and I'm on the ski slope, and we're having another meeting with our CEO about it, and we were devolving again into a bring me a rock exercise, and I really felt like, okay, this was it. We have got to do this. And so to the horror of my boss, I decided I'd kind of reached a dark place in my career, like I need to get this thing approved, or I need to go find another job, because this BA is just not going to function if I don't. And so you kind of reach that point of what do you have to lose? So I just ended the discussion, and I said, Mr. CEO, listen, I said, this is the final decision point. If we don't do it now, we're never going to be able to do this. We're bringing up the caboose of this whole thing. And I committed to him, and I said, listen, if it doesn't meet expectations and I don't deliver it on time and I deliver it on budget, you can fire me. And there's a long pregnant silence, and the CEO said, well, that's not something you hear very often, and I actually meant it. And he said, all right, that sounds like a deal. So I'm going to take that deal, and we're gonna move forward and try to implement EIM. Well, at that point, we had about 14 months, and I had no contracts in place. I didn't have a team assembled. It was crazy, but it was it sort of was one of those cases where
It was amazing. The company and everyone rose to the occasion and knew what was at stake and wanted to see this work. And so it was really a fantastic, I guess, one of our finest hours as a company and as a team to bring this together. So we really implemented it in about 12 months, to be honest, and we're able to pull it together. And that was crazy. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll just get into some of the, just a few things, a few key takeaways that I want to give everyone around it, and some of the things about being a gen-only BA and just some thoughts. Next slide. So one of the, a few sort of things that we had to make assumptions on that we really didn't know about. I don't own and operate transmission, and therefore I'm not subject to the standards of conduct by FERC. But the ISO has a tariff requirement that if you're going to be an EIM entity, you need to have standards of conduct. And if you don't have standards of conduct, that's kind of an interesting hurdle, and it creates some unknowns. Now, I have confidentiality agreements because we're members of the reserve sharing group with the Western Power Pool and the CAISO ECN, and so we do have a separation and all of that, but we didn't have a full-blown standards of conduct. So we worked with the ISO and their legal counsel, and we came up with what a standards of conduct framework that we ended up filing with FERC, and it was accepted. It's not the full, like, blown, crazy SOC that you might see for a regulated utility, but we do have it. The other interesting thing is a gen-only BA, you have no load. And so there's a load forecasting requirement in the tariff and all of that. And so I can't forecast something that doesn't exist. And so we worked with the ISO. And what's interesting is you can't just submit a zero. Because if you submit a zero, yeah, yes, if you submit a zero, it wrecks the algorithm and creates all those problems. So we end up submitting like a 0.1 megawatt or something, and we do that. So we do submit this theoretical tiny little load so that we don't mess up the systems, because the math gets really screwed up. And the thing that was really interesting is we did commission a third party to come up with the benefits, and the benefits were kind of eye-popping. And we actually decided as a team, like, we can't actually go to management with those benefits because they'll just dismiss them out of hand because they won't believe them. And so, and we didn't necessarily believe them either. So we we cut them in half. And then went forward with that. And management still didn't believe it. And so we were very conservative on those, but we weren't sure that that was going to pan out. And then one of the biggest sort of existential things with us is having a really high renewable penetration is, can we pass the sufficiency test so that we can play every hour in the market? And to be honest, that was a really hard thing to answer. We couldn't, there was a lot of unknowns around that because I don't have a whole lot of standby capacity sitting around. If we do all this and then we can't pass the test and participate in the market, we fail. So we didn't know about that. Next slide. So just some things that went our way and some things that didn't really go our way, and things in it. And actually, on balance, a lot of things went our way. So I put on here that EIM, it's a digital bridge to nowhere if you don't get your neighboring BAs to play in the sandbox with you and set up the ETSRs. And it's interesting, you can't really compel them to do anything. It's a very cooperative model. And we weren't really sure how that was going to go. It went really well, and I will give a shout out to both BPA and Pacificor, who really were fantastic in working with us after they got over the initial shock of what our timeline was, and trying to do that. But they were great. And here's sort of an interesting story. There's sort of this agreement in the Northwest
for the entities that the last person to join is responsible for uploading the data for everyone to the CAISO. And so we had this compressed timeline, and we're going to be taking on the responsibility of uploading all the payload data to the ISO. And Bonneville was the last one who had joined, and so Bonneville was doing it. And Bonneville said, don't worry about it. We like doing it. You don't need to worry about it. We'll keep doing it. And so we didn't argue that point at all. That was fantastic. So Bonneville continues to upload all the data and takes the blame when it doesn't work. And so we're totally happy with that. We weren't sure because, we don't have a lot of incumbent transmission or network transmission for load that we can just set aside for ETSRs. And I'm not saying anything that Alex doesn't know, and others. We do find the Bonneville donation method to be very difficult to work with and manage. It's more straightforward with our other entities. The donation method requires a lot of administrative work that is complex given our transmission portfolio, and we just weren't able to build automated tools in time. So we have a lot of manual work there that we're trying to automate, and hope springs eternal that Bonneville will change that. But who knows? And then we had to prioritize a lot of things given our compressed timeline that we just simply couldn't get done. And I upset people as the sponsor around, whose ox had to get gored around that. But, sometimes when you're looking at the big picture, that's just the way it goes. And then the thing that really came out of left field for us, and this also happened to El Paso, it didn't matter to WAPA because of their sovereign status, is 6-7 months before our go live date, we went through the process to update our market-based rate authority status with FERC, and they adopted these new screens and all of that. And so we thought we'd given ourselves plenty of runway on that. And February had come around, and I'm asking my FERC people, so any news? No news at all. And so we were, starting to get a little nervous about that. Well, late February rolled around, and now we're starting to ask questions about, well, can we go live without it and be subject to refund or something like that if it doesn't happen? And the ISO's like, no, you can't do that. And there were lots of reasons for that. So now we get into mid-March, and now panic is starting to seep into all of us. And El Paso actually had a bigger issue. This is just what has been explained to me. I'm not going to speak on their behalf, but they had a file tariff that goes live, with their go live, that the only way they could conform to is if they're live in EIM. So I was panicked, and El Paso was really panicked. And while we're trying to drive everything to go live, we're having these emergency meetings to basically contingency plan if we can't go live. And so we've got the ISO on there, we've got legal counsel, and well, can we go live in May? And then if it doesn't happen in May, do we go to June? And then we go to the fall, and it was depressing. So, we had our office in DC, and we had people working with FERC staff, and they knew about it. And our go live was midnight on the 5th, so that was like a Tuesday, and I think we got our FERC order the previous Friday. It's awful, but FERC came through, so makes a good story. Okay, last slide. So how's it gone? And do I still have a job? So we are 3 months into it. And I'll tell you, one of the things that gave me a lot of anxiety of seeing all the previous onboarding was how much staff people added. And my business case was going to blow apart if I took that approach. We added 3 FTEs for EIM in the company, and and I did not add a new desk in the control room.
And I was determined to do that. I have a very talented engineering team, and we automate a lot of things around our control room. And I just couldn't imagine bringing on a whole nother desk. So the EIM was absorbed into the existing desk, and that was very painful for the first month. And each month that has gone by, it's gotten better and better. And for the long term, I think that is going to work out for us. It has to. Reduction in the curtailment of renewables, and I think this is one of the most interesting things. And I'll just give you a statistic. So in June, this is when things really came off the rails for me and my balancing authority, is after Bonneville and everyone went live. Is June of last year, we curtailed 57,000 megawatt hours of renewables in RBA, which was over 15%. So June month to date, I just looked, and we've curtailed 600. And that is with a huge increase in solar and more wind in there. It represents less than 0.3% of our renewable generation in terms of curtailment. So just by that one metric alone, and I'm going to say that it's early days, it's been amazing for us. I'm a big fan. So it's been great on that, and of course, my regret is we weren't in sooner. The sort of two things hanging out there is a lot of you have experienced this. Our operators are still trying to understand load biasing, and they're overreacting too much, and we're trying to dial back that. And I know a lot of challenges have happened with multi-stage generators. And we kind of have our second go live here very soon because Klamath has been on overhaul, and it's actually been really nice to not have a multi-stage generator as part of all this. And we're going to bring that on here shortly. And if parallel ops and we all understand the limitations of parallel ops, but the outcomes for Klamath are very strange in parallel ops. And so we're hoping to take some lessons learned from that, and that it will go. The market loves our peaking units. We have lots of flexibility around our gas nominations. So we don't experience the issues that others do around gas noms. So the peaking units are dispatched all the time in the market. And so that's been great to see those monetized. And we'll see how it goes with Klamath. But yeah, so right on time. So any questions? Yes, please.
I think I see some bias here because you're from the Northwest and our chair is from the Northwest. We're getting some extra time here. I'm kidding. I truly want to understand when you say generation only and you don't have the load requirement. So like with the WEC stuff, they have the LTRA and the NERC requirement for all BAs to submit their load and generation, all that. So how are you? What surprises or planning issues have you had to manage in terms of not having load for a generation? Or you just do tunnel vision? I'm just selling generation, whichever best price set I get in whichever market. So I'm just trying to understand how it's impacted your future planning perspective.
Well, I'll
maybe a silly question, but
yeah, no, it is a great question. And I do have a load obligation in the sense that my exports are firm and I do have to meet those. So I can't just decide not to, right? My customers aren't going to put up with that. So I have that. We did join RAP as part of the WPP's process. We sort of found that as not having a load obligation, they're not quite there yet for an entity like us. We sell capacity products, so we are sort of on the other side, and it's sort of interesting, with like Klamath, for example, a few years ago, it was struggling financially and you couldn't give the thing away, and now we have people banging down our door all the time wanting to buy, firming capacity products off of it. And so I'm a seller of capacity and renewable energy, and so and the other thing that I'll note is that we provide a lot of energy services and firming and shaping for commercial and industrial customers and their level obligations and things like that. And we have to meet those and show those. And so in that sense, we do. You do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a fascinating, great presentation. So I'm glad things have gone well. Best of luck in the on a quarterly basis and determining and seeing how well you performed in the market. And thanks for being here.
Yeah,
Appreciate
absolutely.
it. So we're going to close things off today with Meg kind of giving some closing remarks, and we're ready for a reception after that.
All right. So thanks to our panelists today and to the RIF liaisons who organized those panels and moderated them. We'd also like to thank the governing body members and our Board of Governor member who was able to join us in person, and everyone who came to Salt Lake City to participate. A couple of quick items. We are expecting to have at least one more in-person RIF meeting this year. Look for an announcement on that very soon. We haven't firmed the schedule up, but we'll be looking for an opportunity to get together again before the end of the year. The RIF liaisons are also working on approaches to implementation of the GRC's directive to provide a roundtable to discuss the CAISO's policy initiatives roadmap and catalog. I would suggest that you look for an announcement in scheduling and logistics for that sometime in the coming weeks. And with that, I think those are the only announcements we have. The reception is in the atrium, and would like to give one final thanks to our reception sponsors, Pacific Core and UAMPS. Thanks, everyone.